Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the special committee of the whole meeting of Tuesday, May 11th. Just a reminder that today will only be recommendations, which will be forwarded to council on May 18th. And according to provincial protocols, myself and the clerk are in council chambers, and our two deputy clerks are up on the balcony doing the minutes and controlling Zoom. I just want to call the meeting to order. We also have all of council on Zoom, all of council attending on Zoom in full attendance. I will call the meeting to order, and just before I ask for a motion adoption of the agenda, I do just want to mention that Barb Kelly, previous mayor of the city of Kawartha Lakes, has passed away several days ago. Barb was mayor of the amalgamated city from 2004 till the end of 2006. She was actually the mayor when I was on council. Flags have been lowered in her honor to half-staff, and I know us, council, and all our staff here offer full condolences to her husband, Jack, and their entire family. So Barb was a very kind lady, and she will be missed. We'll move on to item 2. Can I get a motion, please, for the adoption of the agenda? Moved by Councillor Elmsley, seconded by Councillor Dunn. Thank you. Call the question. All in favor? That's passed. I'll move down. Is there any disclosure of pecuniary interest in anything on today's agenda? Seeing none. We have no deputations. We have no correspondence. We'll move right into presentation. Our first presentation, item 6.1, is a review of the Paramedic Services Master Plan presentation. Paramedic Chief Randy Mello, and I know we have a couple of fellas from Performance Concepts Consulting, Todd McDonald and John Perno, are joining us as well. So I will turn it over to Randy Mello, I guess, and he can go from there and make the introduction. So go ahead, sir.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you, just a brief introduction, if I could. We're here talking about the Paramedic Services Master Plan. I think, Mr. Mayor, you'll recall on March 9th, Committee of the Whole, Mr. McDonald and Mr. Perno provided an overview of the draft Kawartha Lakes Paramedic Service Master Plan. The purpose of the report at that time was to provide council with that preliminary overview and seek any recommendations or feedback, which we did. And following that meeting, some of those questions and feedback were incorporated into the final draft you'll see today. In terms of the rationale, I certainly appreciate and understand that council has a full appreciation of rationale behind embarking on a master plan project. But I think, just to specifically point out the benefits of this work for the paramedic service, if I could, traditional performance and deployment planning for paramedic services truly is a reactive in nature, basically looking at past performance and existing demand to develop future strategies. And, that often results in really suboptimal performance and falls short of being able to truly strategically plan to meet future and impending needs. So the plan presented today has been designed to provide a more wholesome analysis in order to best prepare the city and the paramedic service to meet those future needs and challenges. It's not only looking at retrospective analysis, but also at drivers of demand, such as the specific growth for our city, the demographic composition, health status, and to the degree possible, public expectations around the service delivery. So this plan, it also looks at mitigation strategies as a strategic tool to align our resource requirements into the future with that patient demand. So thinking much like fire prevention, how can the paramedic service support members of the community to actually avoid 911 responses and implement that into our overall strategy. So ultimately, this plan is intended to inform optimal programming, deployment strategies, investment in capital, and to ensure that the department continues to meet the needs that are evolving in this community. So, Mr. Mayor, the Paramedic Service Administration team certainly is supportive of this master plan and the key recommendations, and therefore we're recommending that the plan be considered to inform future strategic planning and our departmental work plans, as well as budget forecasts. So with your permission, Mr. Mayor, I'd like to request that Mr. McDonald and Mr. Perno be allowed to provide the overview of the final draft of the paramedic service master plan.
Sounds good. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Mello, for that introduction, and good evening, or good afternoon rather, Mr. Mayor and Council. We'll try to move expeditiously through this briefing and update for you, representing the penultimate version of the work that we've done. Thanks. To the next slide, if we could. So we've made an important series of refinements based on expert feedback from city staff and our own evolving work, upgrades, if you will, to the information package that we spoke with you about on March 9th. Most notably, we have updated our long-term demand forecast to make sure that the underlying population data in our demand forecast conforms with the places to grow allocated growth caps that Kawartha Lakes works with across its range of master plans for various services. We have further refined our detailed business case for the consolidation of facilities, most notably a consolidated location in Lindsay, and work that we did at the direction of the chief and the CAO around mitigating staffing gaps that have emerged over time with Kawartha Lakes paramedics. Those are important refinements that we'd like to show you today. Thanks. Next slide, please. And on. So what we've done, the difference between what you're seeing here in terms of this population forecast and what we've worked with previously is that across our master plans that we do across Ontario, we work with the Ministry of Finance, the Ontario government's population projections. And those population projections, the value that they bring is that they break down the population, in this case in Kawartha Lakes, according to these age cohorts, because we know that differing age cohorts have differing demand impacts on EMS. And what we've done here in this hybrid is we have taken the places to grow growth cap that in 2050, the province has outlined for Kawartha Lakes as your sort of upside population cap. And we have combined it with the traditional Ministry of Finance projection to get the age cohort. So we have a hybrid, and it's a hybrid that gives us the best of both worlds. The totaled out population that you see in 2046 is consistent with places to grow, whereas the Ministry of Finance's old projection wasn't, but we haven't lost the year by year disaggregation of the population into these cohorts, these population cohorts by age. And that's very important for us going forward. So if your eyes aren't glazing over at the technical definition of that, it's better. What we've got is a better population forecast to drive the demand work. Next slide, please. As has been the case previously, we've talked to you about the aging tsunami, that those population cohorts of senior citizens age 65 and above, you know, are now, we've got the baby boomer population. The front end is firmly in there of the baby boom. Back end baby boomers such as myself, born in 1961, will soon be entering into these cohorts, perhaps sooner than I'd like. And the aging tsunami will continue to drive demand as we move forward. And you can see here, if you focus on something like 2021 and you see the call volume, rather the population projections of Ontarian Kawartha Lakes residents over 65, you can see how it's going to grow significantly by the end of the plan in 2031. And that will continue to drive call volume. It's a significant determinant. Next, please. And of course, the aging tsunami, as we've shown you before, is already happening. And we just wanted to remind you of this. We can see here that calls by age group in 2015 and in service time, the actual work being done in terms of minutes. I mean, there's lots of blue at the right-hand side of that graph when you get into the cohorts age 65 and over. And in 2019, there's even more blue than there is in the two 2015 snapshots. So, you know, the aging tsunami is happening. We're in the midst of it. and it is driving work volume and demand now, and it will continue to do so. And in fact, it will intensify as we move forward. Thank you. Next slide. In this case, what we see is a continuation of the previous slide. In this case, the total time per call, with those calls divided into the age groups, reveals the fact that children and senior citizens take more time per call. And you can see when you look at the senior citizen cohorts in 2015 versus 2019, not only are they above the average, but you can see in 2015, they topped out in the high 60s in terms of minutes per call. And yet in 2019, they're already topping out in the low 70s. So the increasing complexity and care required for the aging tsunami citizens, as folks in the aging tsunami itself also get older, is growing. Thank you. Next slide. So this translates into the base case of call demand. So now we're through looking at populations, and now we're looking at actual projected calls. And so you can see that compared to the beginning of this master plan framework, where we are forecasting in 2022 just under 14,000 calls, in the base case forecast reflecting population growth and the increasing impact of the aging tsunami and the likelihood of modern Ontarians to be willing to call 911, which has increased over time as well, we're looking at an additional 7,500 annual calls compared to 2022 by the time we reach the end of the 10-year forecast for the master plan. That's a 54% increase. So if nothing else changes, call volumes are projected to grow by 54% over the course of this plan, according to the base case. Next slide, please. Now, in this case, when we look beyond cases and we look at in-service time, the actual amount of work time required to deal with patients in that same 10-year period, this time we're measuring in hours, of course, hours of work, not in cases or in calls, almost 7,500 extra hours of work, or a 57% increase over 10 years. Now that is the work to be done. The amount of resource to be deployed to do that work is even higher than that amount of work, because the amount of work per hour of deployed time, we want to make sure that we can hold that fairly constant. So this is a daunting prospect in the base case scenario. 50% plus growth in call volumes and almost 60% in the amount of work that needs to be done to do those calls. Next slide, please. So quickly, in the analytics side of things, the system analytics side, we've got a few things that we want to just bring you up to date on. Next slide. Our performance observations, we just wanted to remind you, this is a carryover sort of highlight slide from our previous briefing discussion with you. And it's important to keep this in mind, that system busyness over the last 5 years, from 2015 to 2019, and we've left 2020 out for COVID weirdness purposes, but the peak hours of the day, in the middle of the day, we have seen a steady increase in the busyness of the system, the percentage of a deployed hour spent doing real work with patients. That has gone up significantly in the middle hours of the day. Our response times on an annual high-level basis have remained fairly standard. But again, in the middle of the day, the busiest time of the EMS day, we've seen an erosion of about 30 seconds in those 8.5 minute-ish kind of response times. And so, you know, cracks beginning to show around response time sustainability. On the important metric, and you remember this one, code zero, this is when we hit a status when all of our ambulances that are deployed at a given point in time are taken, if you will, dealing with in-service calls. And we know that our system-wide response time is about 8.7 minutes, and yet we saw a significant erosion when the average response time for a grouping of code 4 calls that happened once we'd hit 0, that response time had eroded to 21 minutes. In another cluster in 2018 of 23 calls, the average response time had eroded to 14 minutes, almost doubling. So it almost tripled in those 2017 clusters, almost doubled in the first cluster in 2018. And in a second 2018 cluster, we had a grouping of code 4 calls happening once we'd hit 0 available units that had eroded to 18 minutes. So those are small clusters of calls, but they're showing big erosions in response times, and they definitely represent risk events. Now, fortunately, offload delay is a relatively less important or less problematic factor in Kawartha Lakes than it is in other parts of the province and for other systems. And these code black impacts, when we hit 0, those are also at manageable levels relative to other ambulance services across the province. So this information, the message is, you know, we got to keep a close eye, close attention on our midday peak system busyness period when it comes to response times, when it comes to system busyness, and when it comes to these code 0 occurrences. And it suggests that as we move forward with growth, some strategic insertion of resources are probably going to be appropriate. Next slide, please. So with that demand curve in mind, that 50% plus growth, the question is, what do we do? What do you need to do to flatten and manage that demand curve and the resourcing curve that follows not far behind it? Next slide, please. Well, there's a number of things that we need to do. We need to scale up community paramedicine. This is going on across the province. Kawartha Lakes should be no exception. Under the Chief's leadership, I know you're going to access large scale funding opportunities with the province to scale up community paramedicine beyond pilot project levels that we've seen in Ontario in recent years. A 911 public awareness campaign. This is probably quite important to inform the public about appropriate and less appropriate use of 911 to try and blunt demand at the front end. We need to look at alternate pathways. You know, the province is creating new legislative frameworks for paramedic services to consider alternate approaches to providing service that don't necessarily involve going to hospital. Treat and refer and treat and release are options that fall within that catchment of new ways of doing business as well. And then finally, you know, as soon as possible, Kawartha Lakes needs to take advantage of the provincial dispatch changes associated with the new triage tool, AMPDS, that will allow you to better disaggregate this big lump of code 4 calls and deal with them more meaningfully. Next, please. So I'm going to let John Perneau, our EMS practice lead, talk about some of these issues in a little more detail.
Thanks, Todd. Gives Todd a chance to catch his breath.
That's talking.
So, and we talked about the existing dispatch system in the previous presentation, but just to give you a bit of a review, 75% of calls in the current dispatch system are dispatched as code 4 emergencies. So that's the highest risk category. And that means that ambulance services across the province have to resource themselves to deliver a very timely response, that under 8-minute response, for an excessively large number of calls. But as we found with our numbers here and our numbers across the province, the majority of calls that are dispatched code 4, dispatched as emergencies, end up not actually being emergencies. And in the province, it's somewhere between 10 and 15% of those calls that come back lights and siren to hospital. Here in Kawartha Lakes, it's slightly less than that because of your ACP cadre that you have that are able to treat those patients on scene and not have to rush them back to hospital quite as often as in other parts of the province. The new triage algorithm that the province has finally agreed to will reclassify these emergencies into 3 risk-based categories, Echo, Deltas, and Charlies, and allow you to establish different response time standards for those different types of calls. It'll also allow you to assign things like visits by community paramedics and assess and refer protocols to take place. All these things that'll play an important role in redefining the paramedic service. And as the announcement the other day showed, we're beginning that stage with your participation in the palliative care pilot that's being approved now. So it'll allow situations where not every patient has to be transported to hospital, but some of that care can take place at home and release the ambulance sooner, we hope, in a lot of cases, not necessarily in the palliative care case. It allows you to revisit your resourcing decisions as different choices come available. And while some of the choices that we've put forward involve things like dispatching to alternate locations, which you might not necessarily have right now. You might not have an urgent care that you can go to, but that's not to say you can't stop looking for those alternate locations, whether they be addiction treatment sites or detoxification sites or urgent cares as time go on, or simply referring patients to community paramedics instead of to hospital. So lots of different things going on. COVID, one of the impacts of COVID is that it's slowed down the AMPDS transition. The transition's underway now, but it's across the province, but it requires a transition of dispatch systems, of CAD systems, computer-aided dispatch, in the dispatch centers before they can go to AMPDS. So it's been slowed down a little bit, but the first 3 dispatch centers are underway with their CAD conversions now. And we expect that this conversion to AMPDS will be somewhere in the middle of our master plan 10-year time frame, first 10-year time frame. Todd, back to you.
Oh, okay. Well, let's move on. As we think of the flattening of the demand curve, and we think of the opportunity to take advantage of some of those factors that John Perneau just spoke so eloquently about, we've developed 2 flattening scenarios beyond the base case. And the base case was the one we just showed you in more detail a few minutes ago with those daunting 50% plus increases. And you can see here that a couple of different scenarios that we've developed to slow down the impact of the aging tsunami and take some of the pressure out of the demand tire, have some positive results. And we wanted to give you an appreciation for the fact that, in the base case scenario, for instance, we think it's possible with aggressive use of alternate pathways and the full impact of AMPDS, that daunting 21,000 projected calls in 2031, that curve can be flattened to under 17,000, and that the in-service time associated with that could be flattened in similar fashion from over 20,000 hours of patient-centric work to under 16,000. Now, those are still daunting increases. Let's be clear about that. And they're going to require resourcing investments as you grow and age. But, if I'm sitting around your budget table, members of council, I like that gray line a lot more than I like that blue line. And so the master plan is all about transitioning us from that blue curve down to more sustainable versions of resource deployment and less pain at budget time. Next slide, thank you. So we're gonna move from the demand side and the macro level resourcing into the facilities questions that are important to the plan. Next slide, please. And I am going to let our facilities expert extraordinaire, John Perneau, again, talk us through the facilities consolidation modeling that we have done.
Okay, and as you know, we were looking because of a restriction of space availability at the current St. David Street site. We were looking to consolidate facilities in another location in Lindsay proper, and this is the modeling that resulted from that work. And you can see the status quo bar across the bottom left of the slide shows that the St. David location wasn't horrendously bad. It was actually very good. There's a lot of services that would be quite proud of those numbers. So 61% of the calls had travel times of under 4 minutes from that location, with 94% under 6 minutes. And you can see the average travel time. Now, this isn't total response time because there's dispatch time, shoot times for the crews to get mobile and things like that. But was 3 minutes and 50 seconds was the average travel time from that location. We looked at a number of locations that were provided to us, as suggested locations, and then other locations that we added into the mix as well. And you can see those 5 locations in the upper chart. We picked I'll say an arbitrary location on Angeline Street North and an arbitrary one on Angeline Street South, and then we looked at a location on Greenfield Avenue in the West End, and a location at the airport, and the Ops Arena, which had been voiced as potential locations in the past. And by far the best location was the Angeline Street North location. If you look at it, 91% of the calls would be reached in travel times of under 4 minutes and 99% in under 6 minutes, with an average travel time of about 2 minutes, 27 seconds. So a minute and a half shorter than the average travel time from the current status quo location on St. David. And to give you an idea, that's to save a minute in travel time by adding paramedic resources is usually a $2 or $3 million proposition. So it's quite significant that you can do that with a location change in this model. There's some other benefits that pop in. And if you look at that next column, which I haven't mentioned before, but total 2019 driving distance, this is the one-way kilometers traveled to reach every call if the vehicle started out at that station that's listed there on the left, and how many kilometers they travel. And you can see from St. David Street, we're traveling about 11,000 kilometers to get to the calls, and we can cut that travel by about 4,000 kilometers in if we select the best case scenario of Angeline Street North. So from a green efficiency point of view, that's a significant benefit as well. The map that you see on the right-hand side shows you what happens if we put that station somewhere on Angeline Street North. The little circled house is the location that we're using for the sake of modeling. And you can see that travel times of 0 to 2 minutes are in green, travel times in that blue color are 2 to 4 minutes. And that's really what we're looking for. We'd love to get as many calls as possible into that green and yellow mode. And you can see that's exactly what happens here with some 4 to 6 minute travel time on the sort of fringes. So it's quite an acceptable location to be used. Todd, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Well, just perhaps the observation, John, that the station consolidation will also deliver significant operational benefits beyond a platform for good response times, that it addresses the I just don't know a better word to use, the fragmentation of locations that the service is sort of burdened with right now in terms of logistics and support functions and inventory management locations sort of scattered across multiple locations, and the operational inefficiencies of that would be addressed, as well as providing a great sort of response location platform.
Definitely, and that, we spent a little bit of time on that in the last presentation. The
Yeah.
7 different locations that would be consolidated into one. So it's
And the reason we've highlighted the 2 Angeline Street locations is, I mean, clearly, it's clear that the red location is optimal simply from a time frame point of view. But we would also note that the question of whether or not you would have to purchase property or not for any of these locations for a consolidation site, we understand that also figures into your litmus test. And I think our point here is that both of these locations from a performance point of view are clearly superior. And if the differentiation between any sites became the question of whether you had to buy property or not, they would both be beyond satisfactory from a deployment and time frame point of view. So it could become a financial decision because, frankly, they both sort of hit it out of the park when it comes to the modeling of response times.
Yeah, Angeline South is still 96% of the calls within 6 minutes. It's an amazing location.
Yes, so perhaps we can move on. So with all of this in mind, with the issues we've been talking about in mind, and with the 10-year time frame of the plan, there are a whole series, and some of these are issues that we spoke about the last time out, and so we haven't sort of burdened you with them again, but there's a whole series of rationalizations in the first half of the plan when it comes to coverage and restructuring. And there is the implementing cross-border service agreement strategy with your neighbors to ensure that the right stations on any particular side of a border are in a position to generate good results. And there is the redeployment of the Pontypool resource and the top up of the 3 12-hour shifts currently deployed at Pontypool, adding 2 more shifts to come up with a total deployment model here of 5 12-hour shifts, and the movement of that to Oakwood. Now, the timing of some of these pieces is somewhat flexible. And then again, we're also recommending the insertion, unavoidable due to aging tsunami and population growth, of an additional Lindsay-focused growth unit with 7 12-hour shifts. So the 7 12-hour shifts for a Lindsay growth unit, the additional 2 12-hour shifts that would combine with a Pontypool redeployment, those are new resources added into the system, and a recognition that some weak zones in our coverage could be covered from other providers via a cross-border service agreement and a common coordinated deployment strategy. From a coverage and a resourcing point of view, those turn a lot of the red calls on the timeframe maps that we showed you in March into more desirable colors. So it's like fight the red, protect the blue and the green, and gradually chip away at the orangey colored sort of timeframes to improve overall coverage and timeframe responsiveness. It doesn't solve all of the problems. We still have low population density areas in the Northwest Quadrant that will continue to bear watching. But certainly by the time we get to the middle of this plan, we will have made tangible progress on the resourcing side. In the middle of the plan, this is when the AMPDS game changer happens, and there will be a need to refresh the plan to reflect new service levels based on these new categories of calls. Code 4 world will come to an end, AMPDS world will be beginning, and you can take a hard, fresh look at your resource requirements in the second half of the plan. Next slide, please. And I'll let John speak to, so if that was the coverage deployment side of the master plan, I'll let John speak to the facilities, the evolution of the facilities change management side of the plan.
So, and again, as with the coverage restructuring, some of the timelines here are flexible as well. We obviously need to acquire the Oakwood site from Fire once they occupy Mariposa. And as much as we've looked at that station and looked at ways to upgrade it, it just does not meet the standards. And it's obviously one of the reasons that you're building a new fire hall in Mariposa. The location is excellent. The facility itself is not so excellent. And we're recommending that you construct a new post at that location. So what a post is an ambulance response location that they don't necessarily start their shift at. So this crew would start its shift at the consolidated facility in Lindsay, move out to Oakwood for the balance of the shift, and then come back to the consolidated facility at the end of the shift. So that means it's a much smaller post. It's one bay garage, doesn't need to have room for excessive supplies and a lot of the features that are built into the consolidated station. And that's why it comes in at a very reasonable price in today's dollars of about $700,000. The Lindsay Consolidated Headquarters facility, we've given you a couple of numbers there, and it's not that we don't know what we're doing, but it is that it hasn't really been decided what this facility has in it. So it could range in our estimations from 21,500 square feet up to about 31,000 square feet. And the costs are based on those square footages. And the reason for the larger square foot cost is if council decided to sit back and not do anything with some of the recommendations on changes in the way of doing business and just left the ambulance service to need to grow to meet the demands that we're showing you from demographics and from an aging population, we'd have to find room for a lot more ambulances and a lot more support facilities. And that's one of the reasons for that almost 10,000 square foot difference in the size of the facility. There's some other differences in the numbers as well. Some of the features that are included in a new facility haven't been finalized yet. Do you put a fitness facility in? Do you not put a fitness facility in? Those sorts of things. But it's primarily about worst case scenario and garage styling. So do you have a garage that's just multiple double bays with garage doors on either end of them? Or do you come up with a facility that's a much larger warehouse type facility that only has a door in and a door out, and the vehicles are angle parked throughout the facility? Depending on what you decide on that changes the size of the facility in total there.
John, can I offer a municipal financing comment here?
Sure.
So council, of course, it's financially literate council, I know that, and you're very familiar with the development charges regime that municipalities fund growth related capital around. This range that we have here, we have aggressively incorporated a longer growth stream when we look at the population and the service demand pressures that you're facing. We've incorporated growth beyond the 10-year framework of this master plan into the sizing of the facility. We don't want to have a facility that becomes outdated after 10 years. That would be capital S stupid, and you should fire us. Instead, what we've done is we've incorporated growth beyond that first 10-year time frame into the sizing of the facility. Bringing that growth forward is going to front-ending that growth, if you will allow you to sort of manage the mechanics of your development charge to capture some of the growth-related capital costs beyond the 10 years in your DC work that is ongoing and in the construction of this project. And the payment of those DCs, a lot of that is going to start happening in these growth areas of Lindsay in sort of the that north quadrant, that northwest quadrant that your staff were able to educate us around, and that has informed a lot of our demand work. So this is good municipal finance practice by maxing out the DC funding opportunity, and then the remaining, and from a timing point of view, the market conditions right now to take out very low interest, long-term debenture financing on the non-growth capital portion is never going to be better. So this is the time to make this multi-generational capital investment, both to max out the the shelter of the property tax impact using the DC, and to max out the low carrying cost charges right now of well-structured debenture financing, and make sure that this facility is paid for intergenerationally, not just by existing residents, but also by future residents who will also benefit from the ambulance service.
Very good point, Todd. I forgot to mention that we'd actually factored in a 20-year growth plan into this, 25 years actually, when we looked at some of the numbers. So the last change in the first half of the plan is the transfer of the Pontypool facility back to fire. And this obviously doesn't take place until the cross-border agreement is in place and the coverage is in place to cover the Pontypool area, and that Pontypool resource can be moved to a new Oakwood facility. So somewhere in that first 5 years, we've got that process being completed. In the second half of the plan, we have a placeholder in for the Fenelon Falls base replacement. The facility that is in place now has no room to grow and is a bit dated, to put it bluntly. We're suggesting a 3-bay conventional ambulance station for that location at a cost of about $1.6 million. And we're also identifying a need to do a further upgrade on the Copacabana post that's in place now, to upgrade it to a base standard. It's sort of a pseudo base in that it's being used as an overnight facility, although the crews are starting and ending their shifts at the Fenelon Falls base. So there is a requirement to upgrade the sort of accommodations in that location to provide emergency exits in a sleeping area. It's just a requirement under fire code. So that's a very reasonable increase. There's basically an additional room being put in and some exit capability there. And one of the things you'll remember from our previous mapping and modeling scenario is a hotspot that was identified in the Omemee area, and that's going to grow over time. And we're suggesting that by the end of this master plan, there will be a need to build a post in the Omemee area. And the post will be similar to the facility in Oakwood, a single bay. We didn't put a price down because it's dependent on the timelines of the building there, but you're looking at that similar $700,000 type facility with some inflation costs built into it there. So those are the facility changes across the timeline that we've put in place.
So these two timelines, the coverage timeline and the facilities timeline, Council, you're going to have to be nimble as you roll out your master plan and toggle back and forth between them as you think your way through this in your annual budget cycles, because the acquisition of Oakwood and the construction of the new post will trigger the transfer of the Pontypool resource and its upgrade to its new location. It may well be that the Lindsay growth car is supplied prior to your ability to get that new base constructed and get it into position so that we can redeploy and upgrade the Pontypool resource. But some flexibility around the order of the coverage investment pieces is a good thing to keep in mind. They don't have to be sequential. And in early 2022, it will be a good idea to implement, as we have recommended, a refresh of all of your analytics so that this master plan is informed by a new set of analytics, new system busyness reporting, new code zero reporting, because you may come to the conclusion that pretty early in 2022, it's, oh my goodness, we got to get that Lindsay growth car in there sooner rather than later to deal with problems that may show up in the analytics. And, COVID unfortunately disrupted our analytics trend. So we got to reestablish that trend, because that data will show us when to pull the trigger on the coverage increases in resources that we know we're going to need. So this flexible, nimble plan going forward will be informed by that data upgrade that should be happening, at the end of 2021. Next slide, please. This was a piece that we had brought forward, sort of, it's operationally specific, but our sense was council needs to hear the story about some staffing gaps that in the course of our work were identified and that we think can be mitigated from through the standard budget cycle. Next slide, go ahead, John.
Yeah, so these are staffing changes that are in addition to the paramedic staffing that we've talked about in some of these enhancement slides that we've mentioned. But this is a very lean administration and very lean support structure for this service. And frankly, we don't know how they get done everything they get done with the staff they've got. What we've recommended is that administrative support be enhanced with an additional administrative assistant. So there's one administrative assistant at the present time, and we think they need to have a second one. This person does not just do secretarial work. In fact, that's a very small part of the job. There's scheduling and payroll responsibilities and that really take up the vast majority of the time. So there's a recommendation to enhance that with an additional administrative assistant. Similarly, there's currently one logistics support technician that handles all the background support of vehicles and supplies and ordering equipment and moving between the number of storage and support facilities that are there to move equipment around and move supplies around, and ensuring maintenance of vehicles. All that's done by one person with a small cadre of part-time logistics support people. And these are part-time paramedics that, if they don't get a paramedic shift, are willing to pick up a logistics support shift at a lower wage rate. It has a bit of a problem in that if you're scheduled to work logistics support, and that those are valuable roles, you're deep cleaning vehicles, you're doing that sort of support function in the background, and all of a sudden an opportunity comes in to take a paramedic shift for that day, well, you just drop your logistics support shift and hopefully somebody else can pick up that shift, or that work doesn't get done. So we're recommending that there be another full-time body put in place to help with logistics support, and that the existing logistics support technician be reclassified. A lot of the work that they're doing is supervisory in nature, some long-term thinking issues, and we need to dedicate some time to being able to do some of that planning and some of that work that's required there. So instead of having one full-time position, we're recommending 2 full-time positions in that section. And if we could have the next slide, we'll just give you a quick look at the revised org chart that's there. So it's an additional administrative assistant to make 2, and then reporting to the deputy chief of operations, that logistics technician to become a superintendent of logistics, with a paramedic support technician reporting to them, and the existing part-time support technicians as well in that mix. So very lean when it comes to support functions. There's no doubt about that.
We often use the metaphor, Council. If you're of a certain age like I am, there was a toy that we had as a kid called a Slinky. And paramedic services are a lot like a Slinky. The front and the Slinky stretches, of course, if you know the toy, and thus the metaphor in the middle. So as we add forward-facing frontline paramedic resources to deliver service to the public, as we grow and as aging tsunami hits, the Slinky stretches. And then eventually the back end of the Slinky, the support functions and logistics, have to catch up to the front end. And this is a more painful process the longer and the further you stretch the Slinky. So what we're recommending here is let's keep our Slinky aligned. Let's keep our back of the Slinky support functions properly aligned with the front end and make sure that the whole service is sustainable as we move forward. We can't indefinitely add front forward-facing resources and not have a breakdown if we don't protect the back-end logistics piece of the operation.
Next slide.
So we are recommending, as you know, the adoption of the master plan as per the staff report and as per our recommendations. Our recommendations give you the tools to address the unavoidable demand-driven realities of demography, of growth that you are facing, using alternate pathways, using new ways of doing business, and combining that with this sort of surgical insertion of resources in the first half of the plan based on analytics data confirming it's time to do so. And combining that with the asset management sustainable restructuring of your facilities. And the flexible execution of those recommendations is driven by the analytics refresh at the end of 2021. So like all plans, we have to survive first contact with the enemy. And the plan needs to be able to change and not be overly rigid as we move forward. And we think we've given you a flexible front half of the plan on the coverage side. Once we move from Code 4 world to AMPDS world, the back end of the coverage piece of the plan will redefine itself. But the capital piece, we've got a consistent plan that moves you through with your facilities from beginning to end. And we've added growth scalability to the capital side. So we think you have a flexible plan. The time to get started on it is now. We think from a financial sustainability point of view, the combination of development charge funding plus low rates for the existing capital funding debenture-driven solution that you're probably going to need to consider, that the timing is right. And at that point, we will, I'll mercifully be quiet, and we will field any questions that you may have for us.
Thanks, gentlemen. Appreciate that. A lot of information there. I'll just ask for a motion to receive from council, and then we'll see if there's any questions for you folks. I've got a bit of a frozen screen in front of me. Yeah, I can see you. I can see you, Todd, but everybody else is frozen.
Yeah.
We'll just give them a minute. We'll just give them a minute to thaw out here. They seem to be slowly coming to life. So I got a motion. I need a motion to receive. Councillor Elmsley, seconded by Deputy Mayor O'Reilly. Thank you. Are there any questions on the presentation at this point for either of the deputants? Councillor Elmsley and then Deputy Mayor O'Reilly. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Through you to the presenters. Ask you to look in your crystal ball a little bit here and what you've been telling us going forward. The years 2021 to 2046, of course, are 25 years. And I'm wondering, will paramedics still be doing the same work in 2046 in the same way that they're doing it today? or will things have changed appreciably? And I know it's hard to know that, but you're closer to the scenario than we are.
So, John Pernod, why don't I offer a first comment, and then I would invite you to offer a supplementary comment. Councillor, we're confident that the way paramedics do the work will not be the same in the second half of this 10-year master plan as it will be in the first half. So let's acknowledge that in a long-term projection that goes out to 2046, let's pay much closer attention to the first 10 years than the rest, because of course, as you go out in a long way, things become progressively fuzzier. We know that even just halfway through the first 10 years of this plan, as Mr. Pernod mentioned, the AMPDS dispatching tool will come into play. You will reformulate your game plan in terms of how you deploy for coverage and response times. So there will be lots of change in just the back half of the first 10 years. We hope that by then, a 911 public education plan, a scaled up community-based paramedicine plan, different treat and refer options will have allowed us to flatten the curve, that nasty demand curve that we showed you in the base case. And so we expect change should have to come much quicker than 2046. And in fact, we think it will, because the change nothing scenario is simply unaffordable. And so change will come. We think that that change will have much more bite in the second 5 years of our 10-year plan than the first. So the first 5 years will be transitional. The second 5 years of the 10-year plan, that change will really start to bite. And if Chief Mello and this council continue to work collaboratively, you'll be well positioned to drive meaningful change and dampen demand in the second half of this 10-year plan.
Thank you for that. I also would be interested in a scenario where paramedics are no longer the responsibility of a municipality. I think, for instance, Durham, the paramedics fall under the health unit. And is that a trend? Is that likely to happen in any way? Or could it be absorbed into the health system, hospitals, that type of scenario? Or do we not see that as a possibility at all?
So prior to COVID, the province began to make interesting noises about macro level restructuring of how the delivery of paramedic services were going to be organized. And they were talking about, different catchment areas beyond the existing municipal providers of the service now. Those discussions have not really, in my judgment, sort of taken root with a definitive roadmap forward. But one of the things that we talked about in our last briefing was beware large merger restructuring plans that change the status quo, but expect municipalities to pay for those changes. Because the upwards averaging problem with efficient services versus, or with service level differences or with cost differences, create clear winners and losers that are quite disruptive. So we think that restructuring within your service and driving change within your service is the optimal way to go. Sharing fixed common costs with other services that are your neighbors in service sharing arrangements make a lot of sense. But the full scale, roll the dice and merge it all again and let's see what we come up with on the far side of that is a very risky proposition. And I'll perhaps Chief Mello or the former chief, Mr. Pernod, have comments on the cost and the benefit profile of merger mania.
Well, if I could add two comments first, and then we'll let Chief Mello have a word. But Chief Mello and I were at a meeting last week, and the Ministry of Health quite clearly spoke at that meeting and said that they're going to relook at the mega merger, if you like. It hasn't gone away. It's just sort of taken a COVID hiatus. We don't know what it'll look like as a result of their experience with COVID, but those discussions have not gone away. So just so you know that. And secondly, your comment about Durham being under public health, that's only because in the regional government structure, public health comes under the regional government, and regional council serves as the Board of Health. So in almost all of the regional structures that are out there in the province, EMS falls under public health. But it's just an operating department under public health rather than under whatever other department, corporate services or transportation or whatever else. There's not really a specific intent to having them run by public health as such that way, if I could add that. But I think Randy's got some other comments there, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm not sure I have a lot to add through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Elmsley, other than to say, they've covered the majority of the points about the pitfalls, perhaps, of these alternate scenarios. But when your question, if I go back to it, was having interest in other scenarios where the municipality wasn't directly responsible. I think there are, and I think though that before examining those at great length, we should look at what brought us to where we are today. And that was the movement to the municipality to operate the service. And the benefits of doing that was the ability to apply the local values and local needs and have that say per pay. So, certainly there could be those opportunities, but I would just caution that with that comes some of that loss of the ability to provide what you designed to be the best resource for your community.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate the answer. My question was mitigated on building facilities that would go out to the 2040s and perhaps beyond. And if we were building the facilities that weren't going to be used by the municipality. So I was trying to get a feel for the thoughts on where we might go. I have one other specific question, and it has to do with your logistics and adding a body to do some of the work that is currently done by, I assume, more junior paramedics who are looking for a shift, but when they don't get a shift, they work in logistics. By hiring an individual and depriving those more junior members of the opportunity to do the logistics work, which obviously would factor into their compensation, are we likely to lose some of those junior people because they would go somewhere where they could be assured of a more stable shift arrangement?
My feeling is that they're still going to have as many shifts as they want with the logistics side of things. There's more than enough work for that full-time person and the part-time bodies that are there. The issue is that it's one of continuity. If one of those part-time medics isn't available because they took another shift, at least you have somebody that can fill in that role. If right now this whole logistics department is hinged around one person. If that person takes vacation, a lot of that work doesn't get done. If that person gets sick, how does that work get done? We have to build some backup capacity in the logistics department that can take over if something happens. So that's what we're looking at there. This has become a very flexible workforce, especially for new paramedics. You rarely get a paramedic that you hire that you're their only employer. Most of these, and I'll call them kids, but they're not necessarily kids, are working for 3 and 4 services at a time right now. And they will drop any shift that they have with sort of the less favorable employer to go on to the more favored employer. If they have an 8-hour shift with you and a 12-hour shift comes up with someone else, they'll take the 12-hour shift. So a lot of that, I don't think is a huge issue. I think the municipality has been very good to these employees by providing this bit of alternate employment. And I think it'll still be there for them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to move on. Deputy Mayor O'Reilly, you got a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, just 2 brief questions. So when you're talking about the staff gaps and 3 potential people to be hired, were you, is that, you see that as a phase in, or is that something that we're supposed to thinking about immediately?
We think there's an immediate need for them. In fact, one of them was already in process, and before we got there, we didn't know about it, but it sort of has already been in process. But they're definite needs now. How you stage them is up to you and your budget capabilities.
Thank you for
And
that.
it's actually 2 positions. It's not 3.
Okay, and the other one was when you're doing the projections for the bills, for the potential bills, how do you really arrive at a price with the building prices today and going out? Is there just a best guess, or kind of just hopefully, I'm not suggesting it's inaccurate or whatever, but just how you would arrive at that?
No, and I'm trying to remember the name of there's a publication that comes out every year that looks at municipal building costs across the province. Did you have the name, Todd, handy? Because I can't remember.
Altus?
Altus, yes, the Altus Group. And they publish, they look at all the existing construction that's going on across municipalities in different categories. Fire and EMS stations is a specific category. And they look at those costs geographically across the country. And unfortunately for Ontario, they look at primarily the GTA and Ottawa as the 2 areas that they do their comparisons in. So we use those prices and then on a per square foot basis, and then we modify them slightly for the other costs that are involved. But that's what we use as our base rate when we calculate these facilities. Now, in your case, for the central facility, there was also a very well done pro forma of costs that was already established for an earlier version of this facility. So we had a head start with a lot of the work that needed to be done in terms of, some of the other things that you add to the facility, your emergency generator, your legal costs, your utilities costs, even development charges on the site. All those sorts of things were already calculated for us for these sites.
We built up a very detailed formula using our demand forecast about how many vehicle hours of service you're going to require each year. We've translated those vehicle hours of service into real ambulances, which take up physical space. We've built in all of the functional requirements of the facility, and the range in square footage is really just a function of how much growth-related ambulance space vis-a-vis the size of your current fleet versus your required fleet you're going to require in the facility. And we've drilled those numbers into pretty good detail, and that spreadsheet is included as a technical submission to the EMS service as our backup justification for the projections that you see. So that pricing and that square footage configuration is not an accident, and we've paid close attention to it. And we think it's, again, scalable for 20 years of growth, not just 10.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Richardson and Seymour Fagan, did you have a question? Tracy, go ahead.
Yes, and through you. I was just wondering, is Peterborough, you're talking about the cross-border agreement with Millbrook Depot being built. Has that conversation been had already and is, in a design form? Or when we're closing Pontypool, is it Millbrook or Oakwood first regarding like which one will come first? We'll decide when Pontypool's closing.
I'm going to defer to Chief Mello to speak to the Millbrook station, and then the rest of the staging stuff we're comfortable speaking to.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. And again, through you, Mr. Mayor. One of the benefits of this shared service agreement, having me play two roles, is that I'm actually able to have kind of that broader look at the plans for both of the services. And as you stated, or as you asked about what phase it's in, we know that we have significant growth in the Millbrook area, and we're going to have to address that with the deployment strategy in Peterborough County. So we've started some discussions around facilities in the Millbrook area related to addressing that growth. So, and on the other side, we know that we have this growth on the west side of Lindsay. We also know that we are missing a lot of runs on the far west side of the city that are actually being covered by Durham on the other side. And so through cross-border coverage there. So we know that the strategies are going to have to address those different areas of growth. I've started implementing some of that on the Peterborough side. And now that we have the plans put into the shorter and long-term forecasts that Todd and John suggested, we have flexibility of when those actually move. So certainly we wouldn't be moving from Pontypool until we knew we had coverage available that would be adequate in that area. And certainly we wouldn't be moving until we had a resource available or a station available to move them to the west. So the deployment would have to be fluid, as they described before, and flexible over the shorter than the near term part of the plan.
The councillor's question was premised correctly that there are some dominoes that line up, and the dominoes have to move in the proper sequence, councillor. So you're quite correct. And Millbrook is certainly the first domino because it triggers Pontypool, and then that in turn, the ability to move resource out of Pontypool and move the resource to the west as we were planning on it. And these things are all tied up with the station construction at a couple of these locations. And that's why we need to be fluid and nimble. And that's why the 5-day, 12-hour car in Lindsay might interestingly jump to the front of the sequence instead of the back of the sequence as you get into the next 5 years, while we're sort of waiting for some of these station dominoes to line up properly. It may well be that we have to play defense by inserting the 12-hour car before some of these other capital upgrades happen.
Okay, thank you. No, I appreciate that response. Oh, Chief Mello.
I'm just going to add, one more element of the interdependencies here. We know that our Bob Cajun station does a really good job of covering a portion of Peterborough County in the north, and that's not yet recognized through a cross-border agreement. So all of that can be used together to develop that overall cross-border strategy. So where Peterborough can recognize benefits from the work that Bob Cajun is doing, Kawartha could recognize benefits of a deployment strategy that moves them to the south. So it's all interdependent, but it's a unique opportunity for, I think, some unprecedented efficiencies in working together with that cross-border collaboration that you don't necessarily see in other areas around the province.
We concur with that. Unfortunately, those two chiefs speak to each other regularly.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, thank you for that. And I recognize the growth, and, we recognize, the changing of paramedic services. So we have to be able to, adapt to that as well. So thank you for the presentation and answer to that question.
Thank you. Councillor Seymour Fagan, go ahead.
Thank you. And through you, I have a question. So thank you for the report. And now that it's complete, if council supports this, when can we start with implementation? And is there a timeline that you have prepared for that?
So, Councillor, to the materials that we use today, we have divided the 10-year time frame of the master plan into a 5-year front end and a 5-year back end. And then we said, let's take the resource requirements, the insertion of additional paramedic resources, and we set out 2 or 3 pieces that should happen in the first 5 years of the plan. On the facilities side, we've made it pretty clear that priority 1 is the consolidation of the consolidated Lindsay site. And that delivers excellent response times from the locations we've modeled. And it takes these fragmented support functions that are located in 5 or 6 different locations in Lindsay right now and brings them under one roof. And it brings the headquarters function in, so we get headquarters integrated with logistics, and we still have a real deployment base built into that as well. And those combined synergies, there's no reason to delay. There's nothing in our mind that stops you from looking at the capital budget for 2022 and starting things rolling when it comes to the Lindsay consolidation side of capital. There's nothing stopping you from immediately starting to plan for the replacement of the fire station and building your base at the west. Those things are all slated for the first 5 years of the plan, and there'll be a design and a construction phase to those projects. There's nothing stopping you from embracing the capital program now. The first step on the resourcing side is to do that end of year refreshment of your resources to decide on the timing of the 5-day-a-week Lindsay additional resource. And those analytics may say you should be taking that on in 2022, or they may say maybe we've got a year to wait and we only have to do that in 2023. That should be informed by evidence. So we think this plan becomes the EMS tool of decision-making support for your 2022 budget cycle.
Okay, thank you. So the answer is yes.
Yeah, right away is the answer.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I got Councillor Dunn and then Councillor Ashmore.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a couple of quick questions. Your backroom support, would that person be EMSA trained or logistics trained?
So
I think we leave that to the chief. Yeah.
Well, that's fine. I'll ask him then.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question, Councillor Dunn. This is an area where I think we really benefit from having somebody who's specifically trained in logistics, supply chain management. The portion that individual needs to know in terms of applying this to the paramedic service, we can work with, but there's great value in having, first and foremost, a background and expertise really in that logistics and supply chain role, particularly as we expand what we do in the paramedic service. We're now into the logistics processes around procuring and distributing medications with expiries, and there's the asset tracking that comes along with that. So I think there's a great benefit in focusing on the background in logistics.
And I agree 100%. I'm not arguing. It was a question because I see a difficulty if you hire another paramedic and plug him in there, you're going to continually downgrade that position as far as people moving on. So that's the background. Thank you, Chief.
Thank you. Councillor Ashmore, go ahead.
Thank you. Through you to one of our presenters, I just had one quick question here. On page 55 of your report, and I'll just read this one sentence. The expensive commercial real estate model that centrally housed entire workforces in the urban core of the GTA, Ottawa, and other large Ontario cities has been demonstrated to be changing. So what I gather out of your report, you're saying that we should be centralizing, but then on your presentation here in your master plan, it says that we should be decentralizing. So I'm kind of confused here. You're saying one message here in your report, and then you're saying that we should be centralizing into this one, this new station in Lindsay on the west side. where there's more traffic. And
Let me try to address that for you, Councillor.
I didn't finish it, but go ahead. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean, excuse me, didn't mean to
What-
cut you off. I'll let you finish.
What I meant to say is that you're deciding to put this central location on the west side of Lindsay on Angeline Street, where there's much more traffic than St. David Street, where these ambulances can get out quicker, but that's another point. But my main thing is about this centralization thing. You're saying that we shouldn't be centralizing, but then again, you're telling us that we should be. So I'm a bit confused here.
Sure, and again, my apologies for cutting you off in my enthusiasm. The part of the plan that you're reading from is an important message in our plan, and it is that what COVID has shown us is that growth is coming to Kawartha Lakes, and that growth has been influenced profoundly by the pandemic. The pandemic has been an experiment of over a year in length now of what telecommuting looks like now in the future, that workers are increasingly able to work from locations that are a long way from their centralized workplaces of the past. And, and so in the core of Ottawa and in the core of the GTA have been these dense metropolitan areas. Everybody had to, use transit and get into workplaces, and everyone came together. And what we're seeing now is that we know that that model is not going to be the model moving forward, that workers are going to be able to make different work-live decisions. And right now, the growth in Northwest Lindsay is a perfect example of that. Staff from the municipality have informed us and know very well that the people buying in these new development areas are GTA refugees. And they are coming, but they are not poor refugees. They are refugees that have cashed in their real estate investments in these core cities and are making different work-live calculations. And they're not 35 years old, they're 55 or 60 years old, and they're going to enter into the aging tsunami demand scenario pretty quickly. So growth is coming. The population of the city of Toronto actually went down 50,000 people for the first time ever in 2000. So people are moving out of some of these traditional areas and they're moving to places like Kawartha Lakes, and we better be ready for them. And our plan models the impact that this flight from density, these aging baby boomers who are going to arrive in ever greater numbers, are going to have on your ambulance service. And that was the intent of that part of the report, to make it clear that growth is coming, we got to get ready for it, we got to have the resources in place to deal with it.
Thank you.
One more quick question. This was brought up the last time that you had presented this, and you have a different way of deploying ambulances. You strategically deploy them geographically in a rural area, like somewhere in a dead end road or something where they can stay, and then they're called. You had a name for that, but is that something that would still continue? You would still do that, which has always been really effective, because this way you don't have to have expensive housing and buildings for the ambulances, and they're deployed strategically, like for example in Dunsford, which is between Lindsay and Bobcaygeon, and then another one, I believe it's on Willowdale Court, south of Lindsay. So these ambulances are are strategically sitting there waiting for calls. Are you looking at that as well? Or are you going to be are you proposing discontinuing that practice?
So I'll let John Perneau, our ex-chief on our team, speak to fluid deployment, as it's called, and what the benefits and the pitfalls and the realities are in that regard.
Well, and I was going to say, I think that's more of Randy's, that's part of his deployment plan. So I think he should speak to how he deploys those vehicles.
Sure, I'd be glad to. So we do implement, or we do deploy in what I kind of term system status deployment. So depending on how many ambulances we have available at the time, we move them to where they're most likely to be needed. Although when we have all ambulances available, they're strategically located in stations which are within our populated areas where we're most likely to see the calls. So when we saw the mapping before that Performance Concepts put up, you would have seen the heat mapping where Fenelon, Bobcaygeon, Lindsay, those areas are where the majority of the calls happen, so most likely to occur. And that's where our main stations are, and they'll continue to be. Once we move to a lower level of resources, 1 or 2 ambulances can become assigned. We have this fluid deployment where they'll be moved to where the next call is most likely to occur. So you'll often see the resources drawn in when there are 1, 2 ambulances available for the city of Kawartha Lakes. They're pulled down towards Lindsay because that's where 40% or so of our calls are. So we do continue to deploy in a method that's similar to what you're talking about. Whether you call it a fluid deployment plan or I call it system status management, it's moving ambulances to the area where the next call is most likely to occur. And again, when all things are good, when all the ambulances are available, they go back to their main stations, which are already located where calls are most likely to occur throughout the city.
That being said, Chief Mello, I think it's important to acknowledge that fluid deployment is not a tool to replace the existence of stations. That it's not realistic to think that we're going to put a paramedic on an overnight 12-hour shift, and those shifts will be coming as you grow, and put them in an ambulance overnight for a 12-hour period. But I agree with you that during times when system busyness becomes a priority, we have to move resources flexibly and anticipate based on probabilities where calls might happen. That's just good coverage, and that's good science-based EMS.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions on the presentation? Councillor Yeo, go ahead.
Thank you. On your, through you, Mr. Mayor. I know you went through the org chart with the logistics position. On the other side of that org chart, while you were talking, I noticed there's a deputy chief looking after 1 superintendent, and that 1 superintendent's looking after 2 paramedics. Could you explain that side of the rationale for basically 2 bosses looking after 2 paramedics?
I'd be glad to jump in there first if that's okay, Mr. Mayor. So on the professional standards side, there's the position that was actually approved last year that is the superintendent. It says administration. I believe that's the side you're looking at. And then the community paramedic program below that. Those positions are ultimately responsible for all professional standards, all training, all quality assurance for all the paramedics. There's not necessarily a direct reporting structure in terms of day-to-day assignment of work, but they are actually a full department or full division responsible for evaluating all of the care that's provided by all of the paramedics, as well as overseeing the daily activities of the community paramedic program. So it's a bit hard to understand in the way that flow chart is written, but they do have oversight of all paramedics. On the operations side, there's again oversight of all paramedics in terms of wheels rolling, responses, vehicles, equipment. So they do share oversight. It's just not necessarily represented clearly in that org chart.
Recall as well that all the growth in paramedic services is going to be on that right side of that chart in coming years. That's where we see all that growth going, right? That's all the treat and release protocols and all the community paramedicine initiatives and the palliative care pilots, the vaccine, rollouts for COVID. All of that is on that right side of that chart.
No, I appreciate the answer because some people I know look at that chart and, flip a little lid when they see 2 bosses and 2 paramedics, but given the answer, I can now explain it to them. Thank you.
The dreaded dotted line reporting relationship.
Thank you. Any final questions on the presentation? Seeing none, we got a motion to receive. I'll call the question. All in favor? And that motion is passed. Thank you. We'll move down to item 6.1.1, which is the report. We have a recommendation in front of us. Does anybody want to move the recommendation? And we'll see if there's any questions for consideration in future budgets. Councillor Seymour Fagan? You'll move it as printed? Yes? Okay, I'm going to read the recommendation just so everybody's clear. That report EMS 2021-002 Paramedic Service Master Plan be received. that the recommendations contained within the Paramedic Service Master Plan attached to Report EMS 2021-002 as Appendix A be considered to inform future strategic planning, department work plan objectives, budget forecasts, and that this recommendation be brought forward to council for consideration at the next regular council meeting. Moved by Councillor Seymour Fagan. Second by Councillor Richardson. Do you want to speak to it, Councillor Seymour Fagan?
I just want to say, we've had two presentations on this. We see where it's all going. I think they're excellent presentations, and we know that this is a necessary service, that things are changing in the area, and the growth has, even within the last year, has been incredible in Kawartha Lake. So yeah, that's about it.
Thank you. Councillor Richardson, you seconded it. Do you want to speak to it? No, you're good to go. Is there any questions on the report? Seeing none, I'm going to call the question then. All in favor? And that motion is passed. Thank you, gentlemen. I appreciate your presentation today and all the information, and we'll take that recommendation to council next week and see where it goes from there. So thank you again, and have a good night, a good day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So let's take a quick 5-minute break, a little stretch, and then we'll come back and do the financial master plan. Okay, we'll call the meeting back to order. We got everybody, just about, good enough. 6.2 is our long-range financial plan update presentation. Director of Corporate Services, Jennifer Stover's going to walk us through that. So what we'll do, Jennifer, I've just made a couple of notes. Because this is a fairly substantial presentation, I think we'll break it up into a few sections. So if I jump in at the end of a certain section and interrupt, just to see if there's any questions before we move on, if that's okay. So I've made some notes here where I want to break it up, but I'll turn it over to you, Jennifer, to do our presentation. Go ahead.
Thanks, Mayor Latham. So next slide, please. So our agenda for today, we're going to cover a few topics. And so as the mayor indicated, we'll take some breaks throughout so that we can understand what it is that you're seeing and make sure there's opportunity for questions. So we'll start with the 10-year financial plan that was approved in 2017 and talk about what our experience has been with that and our lessons learned. We'll do a bit of forecasting 101, and that's really just to make sure council's understanding how the tax levy impacts the budget. I'll give you an overview of where things stand with the draft long-range financial plan, and then we'll go through the detailed components of it and talk about some of the challenges and opportunities we have there with the capital budgets, or capital forecast, special projects forecast, and operating forecast. So next slide, please. So the 10-year financial plan, as you know, was approved in 2017 and covered the years 2017 to 2028. It was originally designed to implement the 2017 asset management plan, and so it was heavily capital focused, but it recognized the need to be adaptable to changing legislative, financial, and other circumstances that were relevant to our sector. In 2018, we amended that plan, which lowered the tax levy requirements. Next slide, please. So these slides you've seen before, Council, but I thought it was important to refresh your memory on these because it's important to understand what's happened in the past so that we can learn from that going forward. So our 10-year financial plan was the bars in yellow. That was our recommended tax levy increase. And you can see that from the blue bars, what was actually approved, we've been lower than what we planned in the financial plan, which is okay. We needed to be flexible. But you can see that we've stabilized the tax levy increase, I think, which was what the ultimate goal of the 10-year financial plan is. We're not seeing those big spikes that we had seen historically. Next slide, please. So as a result, if we look at the capital funding, the teal colored bars is what the financial plan suggested that we needed to have our capital program look like going out over the 10 years. And the blue bars, what the approved budget's been. So we haven't been, this is capital funding. So this is funding the capital reserve. And so you'll see that it was projecting that our capital reserve was going to decrease a little bit and then grow significantly out to 2028, that we'd have $30 million in this fund. And we've not been able to achieve that. Our capital funding that we've got in the budget sits around $9 million and has been pretty static at that level. We haven't been able to, with the tax levy increases we've been putting in place, we haven't been able to grow that contribution to the capital fund. Next slide, please. And part of that is because our operating pressures have exceeded what we had in the plan. So the teal bars represent what we thought our operating budget pressures or increases were going to be each year. The blue bar is what we've actually experienced. So we've been pretty much just ahead of where we thought we would be in each of the years since the plan was adopted. Next slide, please. And then our capital program, surprisingly, although we weren't able to contribute as much to the capital fund as we had originally intended, we have been able to maintain our capital budget at what we intended it to look like through the financial plan. The exception being 2021, and that was a deliberate decision as a result of the pandemic and not understanding what impact it would have on our resources. And so part of why we've been able to fund that over the last several years is really a result of some one-time funding that we had come in or some alternate funding that we were able to take advantage of. Next slide, please. And so our reserve balance, this is the reserve from the its operating budget. We fund the capital reserve. The capital reserve pays for the capital program. And so we always knew that we were going to see a decline in the capital reserve in the first 5 years of the plan. We have experienced that. The blue line shows what our actual reserve balance looks like. So it's declined at a faster pace than we anticipated. But then the plan was showing that going out to 2027 and beyond, that we would see that capital reserve climb. Next slide, please. And so our lessons learned over the 5 years of the last long-term financial plan that we prepared is that the excessive and fluctuating annual tax levy increases were not palatable. And so we looked to, even in the original plan, it was about 4.5% to start. We dropped that to 4%. And then we saw that what actually got approved by council was something less than 4%. The financial plan, again, as I said, primarily focused on tax supported capital and making sure that we had sufficient funding to support that capital program. And what ended up happening was that our operating budget pressures were exceeding what we had in the plan. And so that was driving the tax levy increase. So when we council approved a 3% tax levy increase, it was primarily going to fund that operating budget, which prevented us from being able to grow the contributions to the capital fund. And then our other lesson learned is just that need, again, for consideration and flexibility for unplanned priorities. There's always going to be projects that come up we hadn't contemplated, or things like a pandemic that impact our budget. So next slide, please.
So let's take a break there, Jennifer, and just see before you go into the forecasting if anybody has any questions. I don't know, we're going to come back and freeze up again, but maybe I can just... Does anybody have any questions on that part of the presentation? A bit of history on where we are in our financial plan. I have a quick one, Jennifer. So when we talk about, obviously we need to build up our capital reserve balance in the years ahead for the rest of the plan. So what's the strategy to do that? I mean, is that what we're going to talk about in forecasting? I mean, it's great to say, let's just add more taxes and we'll build up our capital reserve, but it's a combination, isn't it? It shows that our operating pressures have been eating away at our capital reserve, so we haven't been able to build that reserve up to where we wanted it. Are we going to get there in the presentation, or am I getting ahead of it?
No, you're absolutely correct, Mayor Latham. So it continues to be a challenge that we face as an organization. And so we'll talk through the presentation today. We'll be able to show you what the long-range financial plan looks like now when we start with this year and look out a 10-year window. And the situation's not any different, to be honest. We still are having pressures where our capital needs are exceeding the funding level, the funding that's available. And so what I'm really hoping to have a conversation with council today to understand there are some tools that we can look at on how to mitigate that gap. And so we'll be looking for some soft direction, I guess, from council about what items they would be interested in for staff to explore as a way to try and break that gap or bridge that gap.
Thank you. Any other questions from anyone on that portion of the presentation? Seeing none, we'll plow on through the forecast. Go ahead.
Okay. So let's wait for Kathy to get the presentation up. Okay, so we'll talk at this point, we'll look at just some basic, it's not basic, it's actually a bit complex, but just to make sure that council understands how the tax levy impacts both our budget and how it impacts the homeowner. So next slide, please, Kathy, when you're ready. Okay, so we have the capital budget. Kathy, if you just press your clicker once. The capital budget is funded from reserves, and click your mouse one more time, Kathy, and also from debt. Although we have grants and other sources of funding, these two sources of funding impact ultimately our tax levy. So if you click the mouse one more time, Kathy. So then we have our operating budget. So within our operating budget, we include contributions to reserves. Those reserves then are used to fund the capital program. And also within the operating budget, we fund the principal and interest on any debt that the city decides to take on. And that debt also helps to fund the capital program. And then if you click one more time, Kathy, and then ultimately it equates back to the tax levy. So when council makes a decision to increase taxes by 3% as an example, that 3%, $3 million roughly, goes into the operating budget. And to the extent that we don't have operating budget pressures of $3 million or more, we're then able to take the difference and contribute more to reserves that help us to fund our capital program. What we've seen happen in the past is that tax levy increase that we're putting in is 100% being consumed by the operating budget. We're able to fund the principal and interest on debt, but we're not able to grow that reserve. The pressures have just been too great on the operating budget. So next slide, please. So another way to look at this is our operating budget pressures, plus our reserve contributions, plus our debt principal and interest payments should equal our tax levy increase. So if you click the mouse once, Kathy. So if we use as an example in the long range financial plan, we assumed a tax levy increase of 4%. 2% was going to operating. 2% was going to be an increase to our capital contribution to reserve. And we weren't taking on any new debt, so we didn't have any debt costs. If you click on the mouse once, Kathy, what we ended up seeing is that our operating budget pressures were actually 3%. Click once more. And our tax levy increase that council was approving was 3%. So if you click once more, so what ended up happening then was we weren't able to make that increase in the contribution to reserve. We had to leave our contribution to reserve static because there just wasn't enough funding available to deal with both the operating pressures and grow the contributions to reserves. So that hopefully that helps to explain a little bit about how our tax levy increase decisions impact our ability to not only fund operating, but also to grow our contributions to reserves. And in years where we're taking on additional debt, it also has to fund the principal and interest that we have associated with any new debt. Next slide, please. And so the next thing to understand then is that tax levy increase that council approves each year doesn't necessarily equate to what residents see as their tax bill increase. So within our long range financial plan that we're currently working through, that you'll see a little bit about in draft today, we're targeting an annual tax levy increase of 3%. That means that our total taxation budget from one year to the next will increase by 3%. So I use as an example, if our 2020 total taxation budget was $100 million, a 3% tax levy increase gives us an increase of $3 million for a total taxation budget the next year of $103 million. So that's how that 3% comes into play. It's what the taxation budget is changing year over year. Next slide, please. That doesn't necessarily mean that our residents are going to receive a 3% increase on their tax bill. And there's a few reasons for that. The city has area rating. So while the total tax levy increase might be 3%, if that's what council's approving, there's individual levies within that. There's the general levy, there's fire, there's police, there's street lighting, there's parks. And all of those could be changing at a different rate, all based on budgetary pressures. And so it depends on what what's happening with those individual rates. Collectively, they increase by 3%, but individually, they might be doing something different. And as all residents don't pay the area rate, it means that nobody's going to have a 3% increase. Additionally, there's changes in assessment on individual properties that will impact that increase. And so whether your property's increasing based on above the average or below the average or at the average will impact what your tax bill increase looks like year over year as well. So next slide, please. So to show you an example, these are actual real examples, real tax bills. This isn't an illustration. I looked at a home in Lindsay. The home in Lindsay has an assessed value of $326,000. And I took a home outside of Lindsay. It had an assessed value of $330,000. So very similar, but not exact. And so you can see the general levy is similar between those two properties. But the home in Lindsay's got Kawartha Lakes Police. They're paying for full-time fire service. They've got transit area rating, parks, and street lights. And so you can see when you look comparing 2019 to 2020 for the home in Lindsay, general levy went up, but the Kawartha Lakes Police Service charges went down. The full-time fire service went down. Transit's gone up by about $10. Parks has gone down. Street lighting's gone down. So although council approved a tax levy increase of 3.5%, the actual home in Lindsay, this particular home in Lindsay, saw their tax bill increase by 2.83%. And that scenario would be, as I said, would be different for every home within Lindsay, depending on what their how much their assessment was changing year over year. Similarly, we look at that home outside of Lindsay that has a similar assessed value. Their area rating is only for OPP and the volunteer fire service. And in this case, both of those costs went down as well. So again, although council approved a 3.5% increase, their tax bill increased by 1.85%. And so the specifics of this really aren't that relevant. The core message that I want council to understand is that when we talk about a tax levy increase, that does not necessarily equate to the increase that the homeowner is going to see. In most cases, the homeowner will see a decrease in in most cases, the tax bill increase that the homeowner will see will be less than what the tax levy increase was. And the only exception to that would be if it's a home that has a very high assessment change year over year. Next slide, please. So Mayor Latham, I don't know if you want me to break there to see if there's any questions before I move to the capital forecast.
Yeah, let's do that, just to test Kathy here to see if she can pull us up and down on the screen. So that's a lot of information there, and I do see some questions. So let's go Councillor Yeo, then Dunn, then Elmsley.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Mayor. So at budget time, we end up with 3.5% levy increase. And the word I've heard before is that's an average residential increase. Now, is it really an average? Because if it is, you showed us two scenarios there, and both of them are lower than that. So are there any that are higher than 3.5%, or is that a top?
So when council approves the tax levy increase, they're approving the change in the taxation budget year over year. We never talk about the change to the homeowner. We've reiterated many times through the budget that the tax levy increase that council approves is not what the homeowner sees. And it's because we have area rating. And so the impact will be different depending on which home you live in. As far as your question of could somebody see something higher than 3.5, the answer is yes. If somebody put an addition on their home that caused their assessment to grow substantially from one year to the next, they would likely see an increase higher than 3.5, but that would be because they've made improvements to their home. The other scenario would be MPAC does their reassessment once every 4 years, and they phase in that increase over the 4-year period. If you are a home that increased in assessment higher than the average, then you would see a higher increase. If you're a home that increased lower than the average, you would see a decrease, all things being equal. And if you're a home that was increased at the average, then your taxes should stay the same, all things being equal. So assessment does play a factor in determining what the increase will be to any individual property.
Right, okay. I heard the word average, so the average is actually more on the assessment side than the levy side.
Correct.
Thank you. Councillor Dunn, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm going to take a kick at the same question because my understanding, okay, and we'll deal strictly with Lindsay so that all our area ratings are the same. And for one of this discussion, we're going to say nobody had an increase in assessment value. Would everybody in Lindsay have exactly the same rate increase?
A simple answer would be yes.
Thank you. Okay, so based on it being an average, like the way I do averages is if the average is 3 and I pay 2.5, there's somebody out there or some combination of people out there that are going to make up the difference where I've saved 0.5, somebody else out there is going to make up the difference. Is that not necessarily the case?
It depends if you're from the assessment perspective, that is absolutely the case. And that's where when they do the reassessment every 4 years, they're basically reshifting the pot. So it's the same amount of assessment. Some are paying less, some are paying more. Some are paying the same because their home increased the average. When it comes to the tax levy increase, again, we're talking about the total budget dollars that council increased the tax levy. And because we have area rates, not all homes are paying all area rates. And so that total bucket of money is being split to the folks that pay for volunteer fire versus the folks that pay for full-time fire. OPP police versus Kawartha Lakes police. Nobody's paying 100% of all of the area rates. And so that's what's driving that change in assessment, or the change in the total bill.
Yeah, like I live in Lindsay. I have absolutely no issue with area rating. I
Right.
get a different policing service. I'm not going to say a better one, but based on deployment, my guys can get to me within 2 or 3 minutes. If I live in Sadoa, I might have to wait substantially longer.
Mhm.
And I recognize that. And because I get them here quicker, if I want them, I pay a higher rate. And I have no issue with that. I think that's perfectly fitting and fair. But the general rate, if the general rate goes up 3% or 3.5%, or whatever that number happens to be, then my calculation, for every dime somebody saves at one end, somebody else is paying an extra dime. And I just can't understand. I mean, I'm in a different taxing group, but putting people in the same group, I think they're, and dealing strictly with general rates, I think we should target for that 3.5 or whatever that magic number we come up with.
Correct. So I think that's the difference, Councillor Dunn, is that you're talking about what the general rate is increasing, and I'm talking about what all of the taxes increased. So I'm talking about a total tax levy increase, which includes all of the area rating. And since nobody pays all of the area rating, everybody's tax levy increase will be different depending on where they live. But we could look at, rather than a total tax levy increase, specifically look at a general levy increase. And then to your point, the general levy increase would be the same for all residents, and it would be the area rating that would shift.
Okay, I go along with that. Thank you.
Yeah, I got you, Councillor Helmsley, but I want to jump in here real quick. So just to follow up on that, so if we had no area rating in the city of Kawartha Lakes and no change in assessment, and we approved a tax levy increase of 3%, would everybody's tax bill have a 3% tax levy increase applied to it?
Correct.
It would. So it's strictly assessment and area rating that is driving the different rates across the city. Okay, thank you. Councillor Helmsley, go ahead. Although I like you like that, you should turn your mute off.
Sorry about that. I left the meeting for a minute. Jennifer, thanks for the presentation so far. And I just wanted to refer back to the slide where you were talking about reserves, and you show fund reserves. The number that showed on there, I think, was somewhere between $1 million and $2 million, if I'm correct, in the reserve. Do we not account for the fact that we had a surplus from the previous year, and would that not have increased the amount in that reserve?
So through the mayor, you're correct, Councillor Elmsley, that typically in a year, we would suggest that any surplus, the funds would go into the capital reserve. And so once we present the 2020 year-end results to council, if council chooses and gives us direction to put that money into the capital reserve, then we will do so, and that will increase the reserve balance.
So the reserve balance you showed was only the capital reserve and not any of the other reserves?
Correct.
Thank you. Any other questions on that portion of the presentation? Okay, not seeing any, then Kathy, if we can pull it back up and continue. Go ahead.
Okay, so we'll look at we'll delve into the capital forecast. I don't have the details of the capital forecast, but I want to talk to you about it just conceptually so that you understand what some of the challenges are that we're currently facing. So next slide, please, Kathy. So this is our capital forecast that we have in the plan currently. So the blue bar at the bottom is what we're calling our baseline repair and replacement. This is that ongoing maintenance that we need to do within the capital program year over year to maintain our roads, to maintain our buildings, etc. The gold colored bars on top is our new capital or expansionary. So those would be our development charge projects or anything that's currently not in the city's asset management plan. So any new any new paramedic facilities, which we just talked about in the last presentation, the new paramedic headquarters would be shown in the gold colored bars. The expansion to or a new build for Victoria Manor, our long-term care facility, that's contributing to the significant increase that you're seeing in 2024. Those are the types of things that you would see would be captured under the new capital section. So our capital program floats along. It's fairly aggressive, and I will point out to council that this is staff throwing everything into the capital plan that they felt needed to happen over the next 10 years. We will look to reprioritize this, to reconsider whether some of these things need to happen. But we felt it was important to come forward to council with, this is everything we could think of, rather than to come to you with a plan that said, here you go, council, we've put together a long-range financial plan that exactly matches your 3% target, and this is what we're going to do. Felt it was necessary for council to see some of the pressures that are there, and then collectively we can make some of those decisions on how to manage this. So next slide, please. So that capital program that I showed you on the previous slide, how it's being funded, the blue bar at the bottom is the capital reserve. So currently within our operating budget, we transfer about $9.1 million into the capital reserve each year. And so within this long-range financial plan, we're assuming that full 9.1 million is being spent each and every year with no increase in that contribution to capital. So you see that as the blue bar. The gold-colored next section up is any other reserves that we would use to fund the capital program. Things like the fleet reserve is a good example. The reddish color bar is our grants and deferred revenues. We do get grant funding in every year. The federal gas tax would be a good example of that. And then everything above that, the teal colored section is debenture, and that's our self-imposed limit that council has. And I'm going to use Mayor Letham's analogy on this because I think it's a good one. That self-imposed limit is kind of like having a credit card or a line of credit that's got a balance on it. And so you pay it down and then you immediately buy something so that you're always staying at your full limit within that, your line of credit or your credit card. And so that's what that self-imposed limit, every year we pay down a chunk of money on that. And then in the next year, we just impose more capital costs against that debenture. So we're never seeing that decline. It's always maxed out. And you can see that the teal colored bar is pretty similar year over year, showing that that cycle is just continuing to happen. We pay it down, we spend it, we pay it down, we spend it. The beige colored bar is what we're calling new debt that we need to take on that would be tax supported. And so again, 2024, the big year with the Victoria Manor build in there. We're not sure exactly what's going to happen with grant funding for that, but that's the debenture that we'll need to have with that. And then the green on top is any development charge debentures. So any growth related projects that we're going to take on and how much debt we'll need to assume for those growth related projects. So you can see that in most years, at least half, if not more, of our capital program as it stands right now would require debt financing. And again, I'll reiterate that this is our first draft at this. We're not suggesting this is what we go forward with, but wanted council to understand the magnitude of it. So next slide, please. So this is the same slide that I showed you two previously, where the blue bar is our repair and replacement, our ongoing capital program. The gold is our new capital or anything that's expansionary that we hadn't currently had in our plan. And then what we've layered on top in the red is the capital program for the KLHHC. That wasn't included in our previous capital program, but felt that it was important given council's funding towards that. And then the small green portion at the top is the capital program for Kawartha Lakes Police Services, which would also be funded through the city. So that just layers on those additional two components onto our capital program. So next slide, please. And so this slide again is just showing you how that would be financed, factoring in the KLHHC component and police. And so the slide doesn't change too much other than you can see the gray bars on the top are the debentures that we would have to take out for KLHHC in order to fund their program. So the debt's getting to become more than half of the capital program in every year at this point. So there's a significant amount of debt that we would need to take on in order to fund the capital program as we have it now in the long range financial plan. Next slide, please. And so if we switch gears from debt to look at the capital reserves, so again, when we go back to earlier slides, I told you that the tax levy increase goes into the operating budget. To the extent there's available room in the operating budget, we can fund an increased cost to capital reserves. Within this long range plan, we have assumed our contribution to the capital reserve will be static at 9.1 million. And so graphically, you can see the capital program, but in the chart below, we're showing what our capital requirement is each and every year to be funded through the capital reserve. And so you can see that it starts out in 2022 at about 23.6 million, and then grows annually to 2031. We're assuming that we're going to need about $31 million as a draw from the capital reserve each and every year in order to fund the capital program. And so because available funding is only 9.1 million, if we look at 2022, our requirement to draw from the capital reserve is 23.6. There's 9.1 million available. The gap, to fund that gap, would cost us a 12% tax levy increase. Then going out incrementally from there, the tax levy increase would be less than 1% to fund it going forward. But there's that initial hit in 2022 of being able to fund that gap. And so part of what we need to look at within the capital plan is how can we build a plan that sort of smooths that out. Obviously, we're not going to suggest a 12% tax levy increase in 1 year, but there may be an opportunity for us to smooth that out to make it more affordable, more palatable. Next slide, please. So similarly, our capital financing from development charges, you can see in the chart, the capital program being funded from DCs starting in 2022, 8.1 million. It grows to a peak in 2028. We need 20.4 million, tapers off. It goes a little bit up and down. The key message here, though, the key takeaway for council is that currently in 2021, the financing costs that we have for outstanding development charge debt, so the principal and interest that we need to pay on our DC debt, is exceeding the forecasted annual revenue. So we don't currently have enough development charge revenue coming in to pay our principal and interest. We're anticipating that this is going to be the trend and continue throughout the forecasted 10-year period based on the capital plan that we have currently. And so this is a problem, obviously. We want to make sure that there's development charge funding is coming in sufficiently so that we can at least pay the principal and interest. In utopia, we'd have enough money to pay the principal and interest and be able to do more development charge projects without having to rely on debt. Next slide, please. So here's what our capital debt financing looks like. And this includes KLHHC and Kawartha Lakes Police. So the blue bar at the bottom is how much debt we need to take on to fund our water and wastewater program, keeping in mind that that's user funded, different from tax levy funded. So the users of the water and wastewater system would pay that principal and interest on debt. But out to 2031, the total of the wastewater debt is just under $70 million. KLHHC is the next pressure on debt. They're the gold bar, and you can see it minimal today, but is growing quite significantly out to 2031, where we'd have total debt of just over 120 million. Development charges, similarly, not as large today, but growing over time. And by 2031, we'd have just over 135 million in debt related to development charges. Again, perfect environment. We would have enough revenue coming in to be able to fund some of this and not need to take on debt. But currently that's not the forecast. And then the red bar at the top, our most significant debt draw is the tax levy supported. And so that would be to fund the capital program that would otherwise be tax supported. And that's just under $180 million. So out by 2031, the plan as it is currently, we would need to take on more than $500 million in debt, which is hitting our annual repayment limit. So we would be at capacity if we were to approve this and not be able to take on any additional debt beyond 2031 without bringing this down. So again, not what we're suggesting, but just wanted to give council the order of magnitude of what it looks like if we were to do all the capital program that we wanted to do. So next slide, please. So another way to look at that debt that I just presented to you, there's something called the debt servicing ratio, and it's taking the total principal and interest that we're paying on debt in any given year and dividing it by the city's total revenue. And the treasurer has a meeting each year with the province, And this is one of the key factors that they look at. And so you can see towards the bottom of the slide, they consider a municipality to be in good shape if their debt servicing ratio is less than 5%. They consider you to be in moderate shape if you're between 5 and 10%. And then if you're over 10%, the province is starting to worry about your financial sustainability. And they're recommending that we don't exceed 7.5. So when you look at 2020, we were sitting at 6.1. The treasurer had the conversation with the province, and they're looking to understand where we're going with debt because they're seeing it climb year over year. But you can see then going out beyond 2020, that number just exceeds 10% very quickly. And we would be in the situation that I just described, where we would be bumping up against our annual repayment limit. And so clearly this isn't the position that the city wants to be in. And so we need to revisit the capital program. Next slide, please. And so some options that we're looking for some discussion with council, and we don't need to have this discussion right now. We can wait until the end of the presentation and you see the other pressures. But some of the things that we think we should look at, one is to review and reprioritize that capital program, and perhaps have a conversation with council where you have the detailed program and you can understand what's included in it and whether or not those are truly priorities or we can push them out. Another option we could look at is creating a dedicated capital tax levy. And so that was part of the importance of me talking to you earlier about how that tax levy equates to a homeowner's bill, is whether or not we want to have a dedicated levy where all residents are paying 1% as an example towards helping fund the capital program. We can look at what that would look like and how it would be rolled out. I believe, based on what we've seen, we should likely review that self-imposed debt limit that we have, that credit card that we never pay off. Is that the right way to go? Should we be creating a debt policy that looks at when it makes sense to take on debt? And I use an example that Councillor Elmsley had a few meetings ago about good debt, things like KLHHC, where the debt has a revenue source attached to it. You know, a project that has a very long useful life, it makes sense to pay for it over that longer period of time. Items that are being consumed more quickly, it doesn't make as much sense to take on debt. So we could look at a debt policy that would help to provide some guidance on when we do and don't take on debt. And then the last one would be to create a development charge policy that helps, again, to minimize that debt. Appreciate the challenging position we're in, where from the development community, they're looking for us to keep our development charges down, to offer deferrals and incentives, but that comes at a cost to all the taxpayers when we need to put that infrastructure in place and we don't have the tax dollars to pay for it, or the development charge dollars to pay for it. So those are some of the things that as a staff group, we've come up with on how we can sort of mitigate this capital forecast issue. And we look forward to having a conversation with council about their thoughts on that. So with that, I'll take a break, Mayor Letham, and if there's any questions on the capital forecast.
Yeah, let's take a quick break there. So I have a couple I'll just start with. So you touched on it with the KLHHC, your debt, you know, part of that debt forecast moving forward, but, and you said it only really touches on part of the equation, doesn't it? It's almost like we need a couple of debt strategies. I mean, the housing strategy creates debt, but also brings with it revenue, so it doesn't necessarily put operating pressures against that debt, you know, correct? So, you know, when we look at, you know, people love to say our debt's spiraling out of control, but it doesn't tell the whole story. I mean, there are a lot of these sources that bring in revenue, and it's almost like that's not, you know, I know that's not part of it is part of our debt, but you know, we build a new project, the housing rent pays the mortgage on that and it's funded. So yes, it's increasing our debt limit, but at the same time, it's not putting on the same operating pressures. So, I mean, when we talk about our long-term debt strategy, I would assume that would have to be part of the equation?
Correct. So our plan through the debt strategy is to look at allocating how we want to attribute debt. So, you know, up until this point, a project comes forward to council and says, let's take debt on for this, and council says yes, but we don't really have a plan right now that understands how that debt is being taken on, what it means to the bigger picture. And so we'd be looking to get some direction through the debt strategy on how much of our total, what's council's comfort level as far as total debt goes, and then how much of that do we want to attribute to KLHHC, which to your point, Mayor Letham, is good debt, if I can use that term, because there's a good funding source to it, versus how much debt do we want to take on development charges if we don't have development charge revenue coming in? Yes, it makes sense to put infrastructure in the ground, but do we want to build parks or recreation facilities and have them funded through development charges if there's no money coming in to pay for them? And so I think it's looking at all of the different ways we could take debt on and what makes sense to do so and what doesn't make sense to do so. And again, really understanding council's comfort level with what's that debt ceiling that they're willing to take on, and then we can modify the program accordingly.
Well, and I've got you, Councillor Dunn, but let me just follow up on with another quick question if I can first. So, you know, and I think our financial plan several years ago was a good example where council wasn't afraid to assume more debt, but it was part of a plan to pay that debt off. You know, and we always have the conversation, you said it earlier about the credit card. I mean, we have a $25 million self-imposed limit. We pay approximately $5 million off a year in principal. We put another $5 million toward our capital project, so it goes back up to $25 million. If we could put as part of a strategy that, you know, we have special projects, we want to finance them, but I would struggle increasing that debt limit if there was no plan to pay it, you know, to pay it down over several years. So that pressure in our operating budget has to be part of that debt strategy moving forward. You can't just say, you know, well, I wouldn't be comfortable just saying, let's take 25 million, increase that limit to 50, but not have a strategy to just, and then leave it at 50 for the next 20 years and just pay interest on it, right? I mean, it's, to me, we need to come up with a better plan to sort of, hey, we need to do this, we need to finance it. That's not a bad thing, but we need to make sure we can afford to pay it back over the next 10 or 20 years, you know, or the life of that project for that matter. So maybe it's less, you know, maybe it's less overall debt, tax levy debt, and more special debt attached to a certain project with the understanding that, you know, it's got to be paid back over the life of that project and it's sort of built into it. I'm just talking out loud. I just want to touch real quick on the development charges. So, you know, you've got in one of your slides, we are forecasting to spend more DC dollars than we expect to receive over the next 10 years. And I guess my question would be, why would we do that? Like, you know, and you said it with the parks, you know, and the soft costs, and we're, you know, debt for DCs is not a bad thing because it fuels growth. So it seems to me like part of our strategy, we're going to have to take that DC and come up with a strategy that, you know, we're only applying DC charges right now to those growth-related projects that are going to bring us more revenue in the future. And some of these soft cost projects that come forward in the budget that, you know, 30% of this is eligible for a DC, so let's apply it to that. But we literally cannot afford to do that right now. So it seems like we have to change that strategy and bear down a little bit until we get caught up a little bit on our DC costs. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, Mayor Letham, I definitely would agree with that. And I think that's part of our DC strategy to go back to your earlier point. Does the self-imposed limit still make sense? And if it does, do we want to apply any criteria to it? And then when it comes to taking on special debt, again, what's the criteria for when we want to take on debt? When does it make sense to do so? And specific to development charges, you're absolutely right. It doesn't make sense to take debt on to build a park. It's a soft cost. It's not a necessary. It's a nice to have. But I think that's some of the prioritization that we need to take a look at in this whole capital program, because we are collecting development charge dollars for parks today. But if all of the money that's coming in is being used to pay for principal and interest on debt, it's never getting us ahead to be able to put in the nice things that we'd like to have in the community.
Agree. Thank you. Okay, I got Councillor Dunn, Elmsley, and then Ashmore. Go ahead, Councillor Dunn.
Yeah, just a comment, then a question. good debt, bad debt, yeah, I have no issues with that. Maybe it'd be nicer if we referred to it as tax funded debt and debt that's self-funding. And like for me, two examples of self-funding debt would be Fourth Lakes Housing, where the rents pay off the mortgage. So it's just like buying a house, and eventually 25, 30 years from now, you own your home. Airport did the same thing when they built a series of hangars out there. They had a plan, they paid it off. So that's self-funding debt. I have less issues with that. And maybe if we segregate our debt between tax-funded debt and self-funding debt, it would be an easier program to sell. I hate to say the word sell, but basically we have to sell ourselves both. We have to sell ourselves to council, and we have to sell ourselves to the people that elect us to the job. So I have less issue with that. In all the conversations you've been having and all the figuring you've been doing, I anticipate a huge, just based on local assessments, I figure that we're going to have a huge boost in assessments. The housing market has gone nuts. People are bidding on houses, driving the price of housing right out of the world, which should bring, I'm not saying I want it, but it should bring in a dramatic increase in everybody's taxes when their assessments go right through the roof. Have we figured that in? Are we able to figure that in?
So through the mayor, that is a great question. The unfortunate answer to that is an increase in assessment as a result of the housing boom that we're currently experiencing that has zero impact on the amount of taxes that we bring in. And there's a reason for that, and I'll try to explain it simply. If we have, if our total tax budget, let's assume we don't have area rating, we just have one general rate, our total tax budget is $100 million. If everybody's assessment goes up, we still can only take that 100 million. We're just dividing it by a different assessment number. It doesn't change the amount that somebody pays. And in fact, legislatively, we can't garner more tax revenue as a result of a reassessment. All that reassessment does is shift the pot. So if residential goes up more than commercial, as an example, then your residential taxpayers will pay more, your commercial taxpayers will pay less, but we, the city, will still receive the same amount of money.
Okay, all right. I kind of thought that was the case. What about, have we been able to anticipate? Now, I've been waiting for the Mason homes for 40 years. So have we been able to anticipate any kind of growth factor into our forecast?
Through the mayor, yes, we have. We've assumed growth within the forecast. Again, similar to the situation with assessment, residential growth doesn't generally bring more money. It brings more money to the city, but it also brings more expenses. So you get the additional revenue that comes in because you've got a new subdivision, but that subdivision wants a new transit route, and they need their roads plowed, and they need their garbage picked up, and we have to have paramedics and fire that can respond. And so, it's not necessarily a one-for-one relationship, but you do not see, my experience has been that you do not see a significant surplus, I guess, in your budget as a result of new assessment coming in on new homes. So but we have factored it into the model, though.
Okay, because we are building in extra costs, and paramedics is a perfect example because of the prior presentation. We're building in extra costs. I'm just wondering if we're building in extra revenue to cover that off. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Elmsley, then Ashmore, then Richardson.
Thank you. You partially asked one of my questions when you were talking about development charges. If this growth takes place, and if by some miracle the secondary plan ever gets done, there is an opportunity for increased construction of homes. Would that would that increase the amount of DCs that would mitigate against what we're seeing?
So through the mayor, similar to making an assumption about assessment growth coming in from new homes, we've also done a forecast of what we think the development charge revenue will be based on new homes coming in and new construction happening. And it still is not sufficient to cover the principal and interest on the DC debt. So if we saw growth happening over and above what we've put into the model, then we'll have some extra money, but we have factored that in as well.
And just one more thing on that, we are currently giving a hiatus on up to 25,000 square feet for commercial development on DCs. Should we be rethinking that strategy?
Non-residential is a little bit different in that non-residential growth actually does help us on the tax side because that assessment doesn't come with the same pressures for services. But yes, I mean, the simple answer is I think we need to look at all of our development charge policies and determine what makes sense given our financial forecast on development charges. But having said that, recognizing that there is a fine line between incenting growth and making sure growth is coming, it does have a positive benefit to the community versus having, your development charges so high that it actually stifles growth. But it is something that I think we should look at as an organization.
Thank you. And I'll just move to good debt, bad debt. And I think it's Councillor Dunn touched on it about splitting those things like KLHH, where we do borrow capital and then we get it paid back over a period of time. And I think the same will probably be true of a new Victoria Manor as an example, that although we'll have to take it on, it will be paid for over a period of time. We have the same situation with water and wastewater. And I'm thinking that to count that against the city's borrowing, the province, there's a certain amount of disingenuous thought by the province when they actually are the ones who owe us for these structures. And I assume the paramedics would be somewhat similar as well. And then tell us that our borrowing's out of control when it's they that owe us the money. And I don't know how we would have that conversation or look at how we could do a negotiation with them to remove that portion of debt from what the municipality actually owes.
Yeah, something we could, I don't believe that the province funds our capital side of paramedic infrastructure. I think we are allowed to amortize that and get some funding through that, but the actual outlay they don't cover. But you're right, all of those things get factored into our debt limit currently and something that we need to consider.
Thank you. Councillor Helmsley as well. I think we're due at the end of this year for a review of our DC bylaw. So that's when we can look at some of the numbers and some of the incentives that we have out there. So good point. Councillor Ashmore, you had a question? Go ahead.
Yes, through you, Mr. Mayor, to Director Stover. With regard to capital financing, other than reserves, grants, debt, user fees, and of course taxes, what else have you looked at? I know I brought this up a while ago, but like other streams or other ways of raising capital other than primarily debt, because one of these days, because of the debt that senior governments have taken on, inflation will rear its ugly head again one of these days. And what are we looking at other than these main sources of capital right now?
So through the mayor, I'm not aware of any other opportunities there are for us to generate revenue. We could fundraise, I suppose. On the development charge side, there is legislation in place that would allow us to do something called front-end financing, which is where the developer would pay for the cost of implementing the infrastructure, and we would pay them back over time as we collect revenue from other developers. We would pay them back. It's something that's very commonly done in the GTA. There's that as a source, but you're right. We're showing it as debt because at this point we have no other funding opportunity. But I want to be clear again that by no means are we suggesting that this is the capital plan we would ask council to approve, or that we would even consider taking on that much debt. But wanted council to understand the magnitude of, if we tried to do everything in the capital plan, this is what it would require.
Because there are other municipalities in Ontario, in Northern Ontario, that actually issue equity shares, and it works for them. So I don't know why we can't at least look into it, but.
Yeah. So through the mayor, Councillor Ashmore, that we absolutely can do that, but it's still debt. It's just it's rather than going to Infrastructure Ontario to get debt, we issue shares to get debt. But at the end of the day, it's all considered debt.
Well, actually, it's not really debt because it's equity. So, I mean, that's a discussion that we had another time, but unfortunately we didn't define it properly. But I'm not going to go into this right now, but I think that there is another way of doing it other than just calling it debt. But I'm not going to go into that right now, but I think that if you explore it, there are other alternatives that we could use, and other municipalities in Ontario do use this. I can get you a list.
Yeah, and again, through the mayor, so I completely agree that it is an other funding source. I've actually used it in the past, but unfortunately, yes, it's equity and that somebody's giving us money, but we have to pay them back. We have to pay them back with interest. And so from an accounting perspective, it's considered debt, and it would be factored into our annual repayment limit that we have to use as far as counting for debt.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Richardson, go ahead.
Thank you, and through you. I also want to say that I feel like the developing of debt strategies is going to be a very key factor when we're moving forward. Just a quick question: when you had the 2020 slide deck up there and you had the 12% kind of jumped out at us, and you were saying that we need to smooth that out, is that basically coming back to the capital forecast considerations that we need to consider for next year?
Yeah, so through the mayor, there's a couple of ways we could look at that. We can reprioritize projects to take away some of the pressure that's there this year. We could look at some alternative strategies in order to get the capital project funded and manage the monies differently. We'll take a look at that. We recognize we can't do a 12% increase in 1 year to fund capital, and it does smooth out over the other years naturally. So we just need to find a strategy to deal with that hurdle for this year.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions on that part of the presentation? We've got a fair bit more to get through. Councillor Yeo, go ahead.
Yeah, just a question on the capital plan itself. Like, we're seeing all the numbers and it's like it's setting us up for this big surprise or something. But when I look at your debt ratios and stuff and going forward, and you said 2024 we have Victoria Manor, but I'm looking at it and you have like almost $90 million extra in debt in that 1 year. So like, I know Victoria Manor's a big building, but $90 million, there must be more than Victoria Manor involved in something like that. So when do we see the capital plan that shows us where all the debt is?
Yeah, so through the mayor, you're absolutely right, Councillor Yeo. There's more than Victoria Manor. It's just the biggest component of it. The Colborne Street Bridge is also sitting in 2024 as an example of another big ticket item that's there. And so to your point, I think that probably a next step is for us to look at, to have council see the full capital program and understand what's in it and what's not in it. and help staff prioritize what that needs to look like. I don't want to come forward to council with and say, here is your capital plan, and then a year down the road say, how come this is, council says, how come this wasn't included in the capital plan? I don't think it's staff's decision to make as to what's in and out of the capital program. So we can present you with that full expansive list of what's in.
Thank you. Any further questions? Okay, let's move on. If you can pull it back up, Kathy.
Okay, so next slide. Scroll up, Kathy. Scroll up more. A little bit more. This slide 26. There we go. So next slide, please, Kathy. We'll talk about the forecast for special projects. And again, this was a budget that council suggested we start doing in 2020. And I actually think it was a brilliant decision. It's intended to provide that transparency to those one-time projects or annual programs that don't necessarily equate to into something tangible capital. And really the intent was departments were putting money in their budget that they maybe needed every other year or every 3 years. They were keeping it in their budget, but we had competing needs in other departments. And so the special projects budget, as you can see, looking out over the 10 years, it's fluctuating up and down, but it's not fluctuating substantially. And so that's good news. That tells us this was a good decision to make, that every year there's going to be projects that range from $2 to $2.5 million that we need to fund from the capital or from the operating budget to fund these special projects. But it's a manageable number, and it allows those dollars to be used in one department one year and another department another year. So you'll see, again, starting 2021, the approved special projects budget sitting about 1.83 million. Over time, it goes up to 2.6, never really drops below the 1.83. And so next slide, please, Kathy. And so what we would be suggesting for council to consider on this is, yes, we could review and reprioritize the projects to keep it down to the 1.8 million each year. But I think the better decision would be to land at a number that council's comfortable with the special projects being funded at year over year, and that we use a reserve that manages the ebbs and flows. So as an example, if looking at the program we just had, it's varying anywhere from 1.83 to 2.6. So if we established a reserve at 2.2 million or a contribution to the special projects budget at 2.2 million, then on the years it's at 1.8, we can put 400,000 into the reserve. And on the years it's at 2.6, we can draw from that reserve and keep that tax funding to the special projects budget equal. So that would be the recommendation with that budget. There's really not a lot to it, but I think that's the best strategy to manage that budget, unless council has any questions on it.
I think we'll keep going. Kathy's getting mad at me for flipping up and down, so let's keep going on this, and then we can cover the special projects under the operating forecast. So for my own sake, keep going.
Okay, so the operating forecast, we did a very extensive operating forecast this time around. The treasurers met with every department. We've tried to factor in all the things we could think of that would happen within an operating budget. We've looked at what's historically happened to try to make sure we've covered off any increases. And so some of the key assumptions that we've put in here, we have assumed that the target tax levy increase would be 3%. We've assumed 1.5% growth, recognizing that some years it's likely going to be higher than that. And some years we likely won't achieve that, but on average, we think that's a reasonable target. Also want to be conservative with that number. As I mentioned before, residential tax growth doesn't necessarily equate to more money because there's services that come along with it. But I think that's a decent number to start with. We've assumed no increases to contributions to reserves, and that includes the capital reserve. I talked about that earlier. We were assuming it stays at 9.1 million going out over the 10 years. We've put in some wage and benefit increases for any future for the collective bargaining or the collective agreements that we have in place now. And for any future collective bargaining, we've made some provisions for that. We talked about the people strategy and principle, which is rather than identify specific positions we need to add each year, we'll look at a strategy that determines when and why and how we need new positions. And so we've put a provision in for some new tax supported staff, but haven't identified them as specific staff. We've put in winter control and waste cost escalations of 2% a year. This is a significant decrease from what we've seen winter control in particular increase over the last little while. And you'll recall that part of our strategy is to put in a winter control reserve to help mitigate those big fluxes within their budget that happen with winter events. So we think 2% is a reasonable number there. We've assumed increases in non-tax revenue where appropriate, so things like user fees, etc. We've assumed that the OMPF grant is going to decrease slowly over time. And I know we've had much conversation on that in the past. That grant comes to us without any strings attached to it. We can use it for whatever purpose we choose. And currently we're using that roughly $7 million to help bring down our tax levy increase or take down our operating pressures each year. So that's a bit of a risk to us. If it ever were to disappear, there would be a significant tax levy increase required. And so our strategy is to just slowly decrease it over time and reduce our reliance on that grant. And to the extent that it continues to happen, then it's money we have available to use for other things like helping to fund the capital program. And the last key assumption in the operating forecast is that it includes the principal and interest for any new debt. So when we talked about the capital program earlier, there was a significant increase in the tax supported debt. And so those costs have been added into the operating forecast as well. So next slide, please, Kathy. So this is just a summary of the pressures within the operating budget each year. So taxation in millions, this is looking at in 2022, that 1.5 or 1.25% tax levy growth equates to about 1.22% or 1.22 million, sorry. And so you see that number grow over time. 2031, that 1.25% would equal 1.78 million. Other revenue, a positive number means that revenue is decreasing. A number in brackets is revenues increasing. I'll point out from 2023 to 2025, it's showing 0. It doesn't mean that our revenue is changing by 0. It's simply because I'm showing this in terms of millions. It was increasing less than 100,000, so that's why it's showing a 0. But the big number to look at there is the decrease of revenue at $3 million in 2022. Two key reasons for that. One is the OMPF reduction that I just spoke about. So we're assuming the OMPF grant would reduce by 368,000. Again, that's a decision we could make to push that off and to not start that program just yet. But the more significant decrease in revenue is coming from in 2021, Council made the decision to use some of the Safe Restart money to decrease the tax levy increase to residents down to 1.5%. And that difference to get us down to 1.5% was $2.3 million, roughly $2.3 million. And so we knew that there were increased costs or lost revenues in 2021 as a result of the pandemic. This $3 million decrease in revenue is because that $2.3 million was one-time draw from reserves. So we need to take that out in 2022, which puts pressure on the budget of 2.3, or on the forecast of 2.3 million. And at this point, we're uncertain as to whether some of those expenses or decreased revenues that we saw, whether those will continue or not. But that's what the other revenue decrease of $3 million is. On the expense side, we see a significant expense increase in 2022. Key reasons for that, we need to increase the contribution to the special projects budget to get it up to a sustainable funding source. There's new debt costs that have been added on there. There's some additional pressures in the housing budget of about $1.2 million. Then we salaries and benefits, things like that happen every year. But we're looking at a $6 million increase in expenses in 2022, so that's fairly significant, but flattens out over time. And then similarly, debt servicing is our last line. There's that $500,000 that we had to add in for new debt. And you can see what happens with the increase for debt servicing going out over to 2031. So those are some of our pressures that we've added into the operating forecast. I think what you really want to know is what that does to the tax levy increase. So if you go to the next slide, this shows what the required tax levy increase would be. Again, we see that big spike in 2022, another one in 2030. The good news, if I can say that, is that on average, it looks to be about 4%. So I think if we can do some smoothing of some of our pressures, we can at least get it to 4%. Then if we can revisit the capital program, make some decisions about some of those projects to lessen our debt burden, I think that the 3% tax levy increase that council's looking to target is doable with some recommended changes. Next slide, please. So on the operating side, there's some things that staff, we think council should consider. One would be a strategy to increase the non-tax revenue. Looking at our user fees that we're charging sufficient, could we bump those up at all? Or are there fees that we're not charging today that we could be charging to help bring in more revenue? We can look at opportunities for service delivery changes and efficiencies to help drive some savings within the operating budget there. Or council could increase the targeted tax levy increase above 3%. I think that likely should be a last resort. But those are some recommendations on the operating budget for how to bring that down. And then the next slide. So throughout each of the three forecasts, I ended each of those sections with some options for council to consider. So this is just a summary of all of those to help guide discussion. And it would be helpful. We don't necessarily need we don't need a council resolution, but really looking to see which of these considerations council has interest in or doesn't have interest in, so that as staff, we can go back, revisit the long-range financial plan and come back to council again with some different decisions or with some different ideas based on what is of interest to council. And then my final slide is really just our next steps. So we want to revisit the long-range financial plan based on the discussion today. Once we have that landed, then we'll complete the 4 supporting strategies: the people strategy, revenue, reserve, and debt. They're well underway, but we need some of this long-range financial plan information to land before we can finalize those. And then our ultimate goal is to present council with a final long-range financial plan for approval sometime in Q3.
Thank you. Questions? We got Councillor Yeo and Elmsley. Go ahead, Councillor Yeo.
Thank you, and through you. The tax levy increase is the one that really intrigues me, because when you say keep it at 3%, it's artificial to me, because if I vote for a 3% tax increase, up here, people are seeing 1.5 to 1.9%. So I'm looking, how do we strategize that to truly have a 3% tax increase? And then take area rating out of the picture and maybe make area rating a premium rather than a part of the average tax increase. Because we're shooting ourselves in the foot, in my mind. We're not gaining that 3%. We're up here, we're only getting, 40% of it or 60% of it. So, is there a way to do that, to make it a true tax levy increase?
Yeah, we could look at, well, one, we can set a tax levy increase just on the general levy rather than on the total tax levy. And then the other option would be to look at a direction to say we want the average household to have a tax levy increase, or average household to have a tax bill increase of X. And then we could equate what that would look like as far as a total tax levy increase.
Okay, I assume he's going.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's a great comment, actually, and it makes a lot of sense. So I think that should certainly be part of some ideas coming forward of how we can close that gap, because we are shorting. The other part of that conversation is we have a $200 million budget, but only $100 million of that is tax levy. So when we increase our budget 3%, that's a $6 million on the $200 million. But then we only do a 3% tax increase on the $100 million. So you're covering that shortfall again on the other side of it. So it's just to the exact same comment, is it's coming up with a true number that if we need a budget increase and a levy increase, how do we actually get that much money back, back in an increase, not more, not less, but that it's a true 3%. So good comment. Councillor Helmsley, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, through you. And thank you, Jennifer, for and all your staff for, I know the work they did to put this together. Just wanted to comment when your key decisions on slide 30, and I didn't notice anything on there dealing with technology or technology change. And I wonder if there's an opportunity as we go forward to use technology to reduce our costs in any area. I know that you'll have to spend some money to get to get there, but is that anything that is done? I noted on, I think it was slide 33, that you talked about efficiencies and things. Is that where that is included?
So through the mayor, there are certainly within both the capital budget and the special projects budget every year opportunities that we bring forward to buy software and applications to help find efficiencies. But certainly we could look at doing more. There's always lots more we could take on.
Thank you. Because I really think that, the way things are going, we may need to take more advantage of technology, and even maybe in some areas, robotics and things like that, which could help with our personnel costs. You had talked about a reserve for special projects. And I think at one time we also talked about insurance and WCB as well as being two other areas where we seem to, I'm not going to say struggle because it's not our struggle, but we don't seem to be able to anticipate the changes that come all of a sudden to us from those two areas. And we had talked about perhaps having a reserve, setting it up like the 2% increase, and if it didn't come in, then we put the money in there for when we got the big bounce. Is that still something that's being
through the mayor, absolutely being considered. In fact, it's being done. So in the operating budget for 2021, we established a contribution to the insurance reserve, so that will continue. And we'll be able to have that contribution happening each year. When we come forward with the 2020 year-end results, we'll be looking for council to give some direction on 2 reserves, one being winter control, because we see significant changes happening there year over year, and the other is WSIB. We do have some money sitting in a reserve currently for WSIB, but we'll be looking to formalize that as a reserve through the 2020 year end.
Well, thank you, and I'm pleased to see that. I just wonder when I know that we opt for a different route for WSIB, which has saved us money over the years. Do we have any idea when we may reach the limit on that, and when it would be beneficial for us to opt for the other model?
Through the mayor, that's something that we look at every single year. And I can confidently say that we're still saving hundreds of thousands of dollars by being a Schedule II employer with WSIB.
Thank you. So Jennifer, on the special projects forecast and the options for council consideration, I'm fine with the options. I like the reserve idea, as Councillor Helmsley did. The one thing I do think we need to do as a council or a staff is better define what qualifies as a special project. I've noticed in the past, you get a one-time study or a report, makes perfect sense to me, but then I see other projects under special projects almost like they're there because they didn't know where else to put them. So, operating capital, special projects, but I think we need to come down with a better definition of what qualifies as a special project. What's the criteria, and then have that strategy going forward, either with a reserve or a set number every year, but might need to be part of that discussion in my opinion anyway. So thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, any other questions on the presentation? Okay, so let's get a motion to receive the presentation. To start, receive and refer to council. Councillor Vail and Ashmore, any questions on receiving it? All in favor? That's passed. Jennifer, I talked to you before. I want to make sure that in the fall we can have a discussion about the Cobeconk Wellness Center and financing it, not financing it. We got some not grants, but possible other funding opportunities we don't know about yet, but I don't want it to get lost. So would a resolution now that the Cobeconk Wellness Center and the funding of it in its entirety be included as part of the long-range financial plan? Is that a motion that we could pass that doesn't commit us to funding it all or paying for it all, but gets it into our plan so that at least we can have that discussion in the fall? Does that make sense at this point?
I think that makes complete sense. Any of those types of projects, it's much better to put them in the long-range financial plan and have them part of the discussion and the overall funding solution. Have that happen now rather than after the plan's approved and then we've got to scramble to find room for it.
Thank you. And I'm just concerned it's going to get lost, so I appreciate that. So would someone move that financing in its entirety for the Cobeconk Wellness Center be included as part of the long-range financial plan, and that this recommendation be made forwarded to the next council meeting? Does anybody? Councillor Yeo, Councillor Dunn, thank you. Any questions on that? Councillor Helmsley, is that a question or are you frozen on me? Go ahead.
No, it was a question. This is a special council meeting, and I was wondering if we wanted to word it somewhere along the lines that the motion for funding the Cobeconk Wellness Center be referred to the next council meeting.
No, I've got that in the motion. It's a special committee of the whole meeting. so that financing in its entirety for the Copaconk Wellness Center be included as part of the long-range financial plan, and that this recommendation be forwarded to the next council meeting for consideration. So I think we're covered there, Councillor. Thank you. Any other questions on that recommendation? I'll call the question. All in favor? And that's passed. Thank you. Is there any other comments before we get to the report? I guess we got to go to the report. That was the presentation. So let's do the report. That the report, Corp 2020.
You got two people wanting.
Sorry?
You got two people who wanted to ask a.
Well, yeah, but we just get a motion to receive the report is all I want at this point, so then we can take questions. The Corp 2021-013 Long-Range Financial Plan Update be received. Let's get that on the floor. This is a report, not the presentation. Councillor Yeo and Deputy Mayor O'Reilly, any questions on the report? I'll call a question on the report. Councillor Ashmore, go ahead.
No, I'm not a question, but I'd like to add a motion if I could after this is passed.
Well, let's do a follow-up let's do a follow-up then, if that's okay. So this is to receive.
Yes.
All in favor? That's passed. Thank you. Follow-up motion, Councillor Ashmore.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I've discussed this with the CAO. I'll give you a brief background. In order for the Omemee downtown revitalization to go ahead and get this Connecting Links grant, we have to commit ourselves to a year one expenses, and we will never get the grant unless we commit as a council, and the government sees this, the Ontario government sees this. So we don't know exactly how much it is, but it's not going to be a huge amount. But I just would like to have this motion put in, if I could, please, that this be considered at the next council meeting, because we'll never be able to qualify. We missed it last year, unfortunately, but the only way to qualify is for us to commit to a small amount of capital budget in order to qualify for that grant. That's the prerequisite. That's what they're telling us. No use to keep doing it because we have to have some minor commitment, and that's all I'm asking for.
No, that's a fair question, Councillor. I'm gonna look for clarification because we're not making any budget decisions here today. I think that would be a discussion when our capital budget comes forward in the fall. I'll ask Ron Taylor, he's here, but you know, as part of the plan to do the Omemee downtown, we're gonna wanna make a part commitment in our capital plan for our portion of that at the same time. I agree. I just don't think this is the place to do it, but I'll go over to CAO Taylor. Can you comment on that?
Sure, through you, Mr. Mayor, and I concur. The intent today was to provide direction to inform the long-range financial plan. That project is fundamentally immersed in the longer-range planning. What you will need to do is bring forward a commitment in the 2022 capital budget for that construction and expenditure. And that would be what would satisfy the government's requirements that we are committed to funding a portion of that project and implementing it in 2022. And it will move perfectly in tandem with the next intake for that grant application, which is scheduled for November. So I would recommend, as was stated, no need for direction in it today. Staff already are working towards including it in the 2022 capital budget because it's a known project that we want to implement at that time, subject to funding from the province.
Are you okay, Councillor Ashmore? I think we've got it covered. We're all on the same page. We just don't need to do it right here.
Yeah, I'm fine with that. That's great. It's not a huge amount of money, but that's great. Thank you.
No, we're all committed to getting it done next year, hopefully. Councillor Dunn, go ahead. You had a question or a follow-up? You're on mute, Councillor Dunn.
I was just, it's kind of lost its impact. I was just going to say that motion on the wellness center in Copaconk was money well spent, and good debt. But it's kind of lost its impact now, so I'll pass.
Okay, thank you. Well, when we have that discussion in the fall, if it comes up, we can have that discussion then. I agree. Thank you. I agree. Any other questions or comments on the report? We've passed a motion to receive, and I think we're good. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Jennifer. I think that's all we have. No reports, memorandums. I just need a motion to adjourn. Yeah, all the hands go up for that one. Councillor Vale and Councillor Yeo, all in favor? We are adjourned. Thanks, folks, and thanks, everybody, for all your work on that financial plan. It's good stuff. Thank you. Have a good evening, and we will see you next Tuesday at Council.
Good night.